As Amon spoke, Klein appeared to be listening, but he had actually attempted to leave Sapphira Castle. This wasn't because he wanted to give up or surrender, nor was it because he was too timid and subconsciously considered fleeing first. Instead, he believed that this was the best solution for the current situation. If he stayed in Sapphira Castle, Klein would face 3 difficult questions. Firstly, he had just advanced to the Fool and his condition was extremely unstable. He had to divert a large portion of his mental strength to suppress the awakening will of the celestial worthy of heaven and earth for blessings. Secondly, there was no way for him to obtain the help of his allies. He could only fight alone. Thirdly, under the situation that everyone could influence Sapphira Castle, even if Klein had a deeper level of control over Sapphira Castle, he wouldn't be able to express an overwhelming advantage. He might even be disrupted in his use of Sapphira Castle because his opponent was good at making use of loopholes and creating bugs, making it difficult for him to reach the same level as him. This way, when a sequence 0 the Fool faced a half-crazed, dual pathway error and door, even if he wasn't in a scenario of facing a 100% failure rate, the chances of winning were extremely minute. And by taking the opportunity to escape Sapphira Castle, Klein could immediately obtain the help of his allies to reverse the situation between the two. If Amon were to chase after him, Klein would interfere with his return to Sapphira Castle and make him face his allies. At that time, the primordial demoness would definitely not attack again. The ancient sun god might not be able to reproduce the power of half a great old one anytime soon. With the lead of the Evernight goddess, the 6 orthodox deities were enough to deal with Amon. Even if Amon, who was in control of all the authorities of the error and door domains, wasn't easily killed, the orthodox deities would definitely be able to weaken him and seal him. After Klein stabilized his mental state and deepened his control over Sapphira Castle, he could then kill him in a targeted manner. This process was almost irreversible. Even if the ancient sun god could still produce the level, status and strength from before, his limit appeared to be suppressing 3 orthodox deities at the same time, and this didn't include the Evernight goddess. Of course, the outer deities were undoubtedly unwilling to see the birth of a new lord of the mysteries. Once such a situation happened, they would definitely try their best to interfere, preventing Amon from dying. However, before the world barrier collapsed, the influence they could exert would be rather limited, and it might not be of much use. Just like before, Klein believed that the combined powers of the dark side of the universe and the chained god were inferior to the hidden sage. Even if the outer deities managed to affect the situation, Klein wouldn't suffer any losses. After all, those existences wouldn't allow Amon to kill him either. He could find a place to hide and stabilize his mental state. Once he was prepared, he could make new plans again. The foggy town of the Evernight goddess was a very good choice. If Amon didn't chase after him and remained inside Sapphira Castle, Klein could use his identity as the owner of Sapphira Castle to influence the control of all kinds of matters within at any moment, preventing Amon from doing anything in Sapphira Castle. Even if he wanted to use the Crimson Star to deal with the Tarot Club members, it would be impossible. In short, it would be extremely difficult for either of them to use Sapphira Castle well, but destroying the other party's attempts was definitely simple. Under such a stalemate, Klein had time to stabilize his mental state, deepening his control over Sapphira Castle, slowly turning the situation around. Towards the end, Amon would either flee and hide, or he would let the celestial worthy of heaven and earth for blessings completely revive, choosing to have an internecine outcome with Klein. Therefore, although he didn't have the time to analyze the pros and cons, Klein quickly came to a conclusion. Leaving Sapphira Castle now was the best choice. However, just as his consciousness sank to the edge of Sapphira Castle, he saw a crystal monocle. This item appeared in time, crushing Klein's hopes of escaping. "Did you think I'd leave such an obvious loophole? Of course, you can stop me from leaving Sapphira Castle at any time." Amon curled his index finger and pressed it against the monocle as he smiled. Behind the chair that he was sitting on, the resplendent symbol rapidly changed. At times, it was formed from symbols corresponding to parasitizing, time, and fate. At times, it was a series of doors. These 2 different symbols appeared one after another, making it impossible to truly be fixed. Klein didn't hear what Amon said. The moment he failed, he created a real realm of mysteries, a complete divine kingdom of the Fool. Light and shadows instantly changed in front of Amon's eyes. It brought with it the disappearance of the grand palace, model table, and luxurious high-back chair, bringing with it an ancient castle. Amon wasn't sure what the ancient castle looked like. This was because he was standing in a corridor inside the castle. He could only sense the various changes in Sapphira Castle and see with the limited vision he had. The corridor was unusually dark and gloomy. The corridor stretched endlessly. There were silver-colored elegant candlestands spaced widely apart, each producing a dim and yellow glow. There were dark red wooden doors on both sides of the corridor that seemed to connect to different rooms. There was no sound from the rooms, making it virtually impossible to know what was hidden inside. Amon casually glanced at it and smiled with interest. Interesting. As the most powerful cryptologist, he naturally knew that this was a divine kingdom, one that couldn't be broken through with brute force. This was because every door was reassembled with different items. If he forcefully broke through them, he would trigger unknown effects. Amon didn't underestimate the abilities and intelligence of a Sequence Zero the Fool. He didn't plan on experiencing any more surprises or accidents. However, once the Divine Kingdom's rules were fixed, its owner would similarly be restricted to a certain extent. To put it simply, Klein was definitely in one of the rooms, not somewhere else. One had to bear the corresponding responsibility for the benefits obtained. You want to use this method to stall for time and stabilize your mental state? Amon whispered as though he was talking to an invisible person. Then, wearing a pointed hat and a classic black robe, he walked to the nearest dark red wooden door. There were no holes on the wooden door, so he couldn't see the exact situation inside. In other words, it was very difficult for Amon to know if Klein was here without opening the door. The corners of Amon's mouth curled up slightly. Amon extended his right hand and drew a long rectangular shape on the dark red wooden door. Inside the rectangle, bits of starlight emerged and turned transparent, revealing the scene in the room. With the authority of door and the ability of bug, Amon forcibly opened a window without triggering the effects. Following that, he cast his gaze into the room. There were no tables, chairs, carpets, and other furniture, but a blue sea. Indeed, this door has been connected with the sea outside, Amon said without any surprise. Once he twisted the door, he would leave Sapphira Castle and appear in the sea outside. And at that time, with Klein being wary, it was almost impossible for him to enter Sapphira Castle again, just like how Klein was unable to leave Sapphira Castle. This was the reason why Amon didn't forcibly destroy the Fool's divine kingdom, but opened one door at a time. Destruction led to similar effects. The repeated effects would affect Amon again and again. Even if there were many loopholes that he could use, he wouldn't be completely immune to them. Retracting his gaze, Amon walked to the opposite room and opened a window according to the method from before. However, this time, it was pitch black inside, and he couldn't see anything. Amon raised his hand and pinched the edge of his monocle and coughed lightly. His figure instantly split into two. The number of almonds increased. The split Amon glanced at Amon, who stood in the same spot and sked. "Why aren't you seeking the thrill yourself?" As he spoke, this Amon extended his right palm and grabbed the handle of the dark red wooden door. Just as he began twisting, his expression suddenly turned blank as he sat down, as though he had lost the ability to think. Fooling effect. The original Amon nodded slightly. The retarded Amon immediately collapsed and turned into a transparent worm with 12 segments. Tiny bits of Beyonder characteristics seeped out and returned to Amon's body. He relied on using the loophole to avoid the negative effects of his avatars from acting on his actual body. After all the Beyonder characteristics returned, Amon released a flame that had been stolen and burned the corpse of the Worm of Time. After doing this leisurely, he looked up and adjusted the monocle on his right eye. On the crystal monocle, countless symbols, patterns, and labels appeared. They moved quickly, interweaving, reforming, or changing, as though they were making calculations. This was a combination of a cryptologist's power of decryption and the key of Star's authority on position. The two attempts Amon made were mainly to gather intelligence, grasp the rules, and prepare for cracking the secrets of the Fool's divine kingdom. Soon, the symbols, patterns, and labels formed a scene on the monocle. Behind a dark red wooden door, a few slippery tentacles extended out from Klein's body. He sat on a high-backed chair and calmly watched the entrance. The corners of Amon's mouth curled up. With a flash, he appeared in the room. However, everything before his eyes suddenly collapsed. Klein with the Fool's aura quickly turned thin, turning into a card. On the card, Roselle Gustave was wearing a gorgeous head accessory and colorful clothes, holding a stick with luggage hanging from it. His eyes were filled with longing. The Fool card. The Fool card from the Cards of Blasphemy. Klein knew that relying solely on paper figurine substitutes and adding the fooling effect and grafting his true aura onto it wouldn't be able to deceive a top-notch swindler like Amon. Therefore, he used the Fool card, which had some convergence powers, as his paper figurine. Although Sapphira Castle couldn't be used again, this was Klein's home ground after all. There was his junk pile, the various items he had gathered, and the newly obtained Trunsoist brass book and the borrowed magic wishing lamp. Chapter 1383 stipulated rules. With the Klein in front of Amon turning into the Fool card, the room shrank and revealed its original appearance. It was an iron cigar case that had marks of being corroded slightly. It had fused with the aura of Sapphira Castle. Klein's figure appeared out of nowhere as the entire divine kingdom of the Fool collapsed. As the magnificent palace reappeared, he grabbed the vessel that carried the Fool card and Amon's true body and suddenly closed it. He didn't have hopes of using this item to seal Amon, who wielded the corresponding authority of the door pathway. All he wanted was to buy some time and find a chance to throw Amon out of Sapphira Castle and retrieve the initiative. But at that moment, Klein, who was wearing a black trench coat, paused. His other hand took out a crystal monocle from the void with his other hand and placed it in his right eye. Behind him, Amon, who was wearing a pointed hat and a classic black robe, quickly outlined his figure. His eyes were dark and wild as he laughed. "What made you think that I didn't use an avatar?" Before he finished his sentence, Klein's figure that had been parasitized rapidly turned thin, turning into a crude paper figurine. Klein was cautious and hadn't used his true form either. He relied on a paper figurine substitute that had spirit body threads grafted. He knew very well that he would rather give up an opportunity than make mistakes when fighting Amon. Once he made a mistake, under the suppression effect of a bug, it would be very difficult for him to turn the tables. With regards to the situation of the prey turning into a paper figurine, Amon didn't seem to be surprised. All he did was raise his hand to touch the crystal monocle. At the other end of the Grand Palace, Klein, who was wearing a top hat and a trench coat, uncontrollably walked out of the Fool's automatic concealment. He raised his right hand and took out a crystal monocle from the void with great difficulty, slowly moving it towards his right eye. During this process, Klein's expression was filled with resistance and rather warped, as though he couldn't control his hand. The half-crazy Amon smiled leisurely. "You can use paper figurines to replace you, but so can paper figurines replace you. It being parasitized is equivalent to you being parasitized. Everything is relative, and all of them have loopholes. No beyond a power is uncrackable. They can be used in any suitable situation." He made use of the relationship of the paper figurine substitute and the main body to create a bug. Although Amon looked like he was unable to control his desire to speak due to his madness, it didn't stop him from corroding Klein with his full strength. He strengthened the parasitizing bit by bit, making Klein truly wear a monocle and become him. At that moment, Klein's body suddenly collapsed. He had taken the initiative to do so. He split into countless transparent maggots that swam in all directions. Among these worms of spirit, there were a few worms of time with 12 segments mixed in. Strictly speaking, Amon's worms of time could forcefully parasitize very tiny creatures like the worms of spirit. However, when Klein split up, he took the initiative to use his fooling authority to confuse the order of time. He fooled the few worms of time, making them split up only towards the end. Unable to find the cluster of worms of spirit, they lost their target for parasitizing. In the next second, the scene in Sapphira Castle changed again. Klein once again used the Realm of Mystery's powers to create a new divine kingdom for the Fool. Amon instantly entered a room. This place was covered with a thick yellow carpet with a crystal chandelier hanging from it. There was a door on each wall, and it was unknown where they led to. At the same time, there were oil paintings depicting various eyes hanging from the four walls. There was no need for any special scrutiny. With just a glance, Amon knew that the four doors corresponded to different effects. The main purpose was to delay his actions and create enough time for Klein to make subsequent preparations. The corners of Mr. Error curled up slightly as he cast his gaze to the ground. He extended his right fist and stretched out his fingers. An illusory door appeared on the thick yellow carpet. The door quickly moved for a second before it became fixed in place and silently opened. However, with the opening of the illusory door, the doors around the room began to move strangely. The doors creaked and opened. Almost at the same time, in the pitch-black wilderness, in a dark tower that led to the sky, Klein was holding the magic wishing lamp and removing the effects of fooling on the Trunsoist brass book. The candle wick of the magic wishing lamp lit up as it spewed out a sticky, pale gold glow. These rays of light transformed into a distorted, blurry figure. Klein didn't consider making a wish with the genie to transfer Bernadette's wishes onto him and change the ownership of the magic wishing lamp. This was because there would only be one outcome. He would die on the spot and return from the fog of history with the miracle invoker's powers. Normally, this was a good way to escape, especially since Klein could revive several times. However, the situation this time was completely different from before. Once Klein died, it would mean that he had temporarily given up on his identity as the owner of Sapphira Castle, making this place a paradise for Amon. He could use this Sapphira without any obstruction. Under such circumstances, Amon could completely fool history, interfere with fate, and suppress Klein's resurrection, making him truly die. The ones who were most effective against a Beyonder were definitely higher sequence Beyonders of the same pathway. Therefore, Klein's current plan was to use the status of the genie to better use the Trunsoist brass book. If the genie didn't exert a certain influence, the rules set by the Trunsoist brass book definitely wouldn't be biased towards Klein. It would only restrict all existences other than itself. As the genie's blurry, pale gold figure took form, the Trunsoist brass book produced the sound of colliding metal and quickly flipped to the second half of the book that allowed writing. Without any gap in time, new text appeared on the brass page. Theft is prohibited here. If Klein had the choice, the most suitable rule would be, acts of theft are prohibited here, because the former clause was a law. It couldn't stop someone from committing theft ahead of time, and it could only deliver punishment after the act. Furthermore, punishment for first-time thieves was inevitably light, something the Amons could withstand. His idea restricted the possibility of such actions. There was no such thing as theft. However, there was no way for the Trunsoist brass book to make such a rule right now. One had to wait until the provisions were watertight enough, and that it had awakened to a certain extent before that was possible. Previously, the genie had relied on his close connection with the Trunsoist brass book, his high status, and all his strength before he could enforce similar rules. At this moment, he was already drained and unable to do such things. At present, all Klein could do was try his best to stall for time, so that the Trunsoist brass book could produce a sufficiently strict setup of laws to target Amon so as to act in concert with his fooling authority. At this moment, in the room that trapped Amon, as the illusory door on the ground opened, the 4 real doors shook and cracks appeared. This would bring about many unknown effects. Suddenly, the sound of a bell rang out from an endless distance away. At some point in time, Amon had transformed into an ancient, mottled stone wall clock. On the wall clock, the second hand formed by the worm of time suddenly paused. Gong! As the bell reverberated, everything in the room froze strangely, including the 4 doors. The only exception was Amon. He had transformed back to his pointy-hatted classic black-robed look. With a smile, he calmly raised his left hand and tightened his 5 fingers. In the next second, the strange frozen state was broken. The 4 doors that were about to open had closed again with a bang, leaving no gaps behind. Amon's figure descended and burrowed into the illusory door that wasn't closed. Just as he used this method to leave the room, he discovered that he had arrived in a pitch-black wilderness. There was a dark tower that seemed to pierce the sky in the distance. Inside the tower, the Trunsoist brass book in front of Klein had formed a second rule. Deception is prohibited here. Although Amon couldn't see what was happening, it was as though he had sensed something. After all, a high-ranking person who used the rules of deception as entertainment was undoubtedly able to sense the changes in the rules. Otherwise, there was no way of accurately finding loopholes. He immediately raised his hand and adjusted the monocle stuck in his right eye. On the surface of the crystal monocle, a blinding pure white light spewed out, illuminating the wilderness. There were no longer any concealed existences here. This was the eternal daytime that he had previously given to Klein and retrieved from Klein's main body. In such an environment, the dark tower melted inch by inch. Klein floated in midair with one hand holding the magic wishing lamp, and the other holding the staff of the stars. In front of him was the open trunsoist brass book. Amon took the opportunity to stretch out his hand that was holding onto the monocle. From a distance, he gripped Klein's projection to his palm. Behind him, the shadow that had been dragged out by the eternal daytime seemed to become fainter as it twisted with vitality. Without a sound, Amon began stealing Klein's various beyonder powers. He didn't deliberately seek out the fooling authority. Instead, he chose to be random to increase the success rate. However, with a flash of light, what fell into his palm was only a simple paper figurine. Grafting. Pa! The shadow behind Amon's back was lashed by an invisible whip, and he was completely unharmed. He created an error, letting his shadow replace him. Following that, Amon laughed as his voice resounded in Klein's ears. Genie, I can also promise to send you back to the cosmos. Look, I wasn't punished. This means that I'm not swindling you. Chapter 1384 Conceptualization. Upon hearing Amon's words, Klein's heart sank. Before this, he wasn't worried that Amon would collude with Genie, because he was a top-notch swindler. No promises he made could be believed. As for Genie, he had encountered the former Lord of the Mysteries. He was considered a victim of such matters in a similar vein. Therefore, he would definitely use his most wary of approaches to deal with Mr. Error. This was the result of a lack of trust. Sometimes, lying, cheating and swindling could indeed increase the profits in the short term, but in the long term, it was better to be honest. But now, the trunsoist brass book had just formulated the rule of deception is prohibited here. And Amon didn't receive any punishment after making the promise. At the same time, Klein and Genie didn't notice him using any loopholes. This proved how true and effective Amon's words were. It was from the bottom of his heart and wasn't a scam. Genie could even rely on his own level and traits to distort the sentence from I can promise to I promise. It would make it impossible for Amon to go back on his word. If he did, he would suffer damage at the level of a great old one. This made Klein not help but wonder if the rule that deception is prohibited here was secretly guided by Amon or deliberately created by Genie, making any Lord of the Mysteries candidate to promise to return him to the cosmos. To Genie, he didn't suffer any losses in such a deal because Klein himself owed him a promise. If it were any other scene, Klein would still have the time to communicate with Genie and rebuild his trust. However, at this moment, Amon's threat was right before his eyes. He wouldn't give him the chance to resolve this problem. If he chose to continue to believe in Genie, Klein would be putting his life in the hands of this outer deity and be under his control. In the subsequent battle, as long as Genie was able to formulate a few rules that appeared to be fine but were biased towards Amon through the trunsoist brass book, Klein, who was already at a great disadvantage, would rapidly lose with no way to reverse the situation. As his thoughts raced, Klein made the choice of this gamble. A translucent dark-colored cloak instantly appeared around him. His face was covered with a strange and distorted mask. The fool! Invisible rings rippled from his body and instantly enveloped Genie, the trunsoist brass book, and the entire wilderness, as well as Amon. Blind stupidity, authority. Amon's monocle temporarily lost its luster, as though he had lost his vision. His gaze also turned dull. The speed of text being written on the trunsoist brass book clearly slowed down as though it would take 15 minutes or even hours to think up the next rule. Genie's blurry and distorted golden figure shook as it suddenly shrank back into the golden magic lamp that looked like a water flask. It was unknown if it was escaping or if it was purely an instinctual reaction. Seizing this opportunity, Klein attempted to escape Sapphira Castle as he prepared to graft something to himself. Just as his consciousness sank, the crystal monocle appeared at the edge of Sapphira Castle, blocking his path. Even though his intelligence had been reduced briefly, Amon still seemed to remember to stop Klein from leaving Sapphira Castle. His eyes quickly regained clarity as they were still dyed black. His mouth slowly opened as he laughed uncontrollably. I've written this matter into my instinct. This is a good way to resist the effects of blind stupidity. Clearly, he had cheated the rules and lied to himself, making his instincts believe that this was what he wanted. Klein wasn't depressed. He immediately completed the grafting he had prepared long ago. In the cosmos, a giant star that emitted light and heat suddenly dimmed. In the wilderness with the effects of eternal daylight, an orange sun with a destructive aura and a heavy feeling descended from the sky. The entire wilderness collapsed and curled up as though it was going to charge straight into the star. At the same time, everything here was ignited, including Amon. In the next second, the surrounding void began to shrink as they revolved around the real sun. Everything in the world either disintegrated or vaporized. All that was left was the magic wishing lamp and the Trunsoist brass book, which was still struggling to withstand the flames, barely suffering any damage. Klein, who was floating in midair, had long disappeared. He had grafted himself to that star. Of course, his grafting was only with the concept of a star, not a physical entity. Otherwise, with the Fool's obviously lower defense than most Sequence OS, he would be directly swallowed by a real star and die on the spot thanks to his relatively weak body. The Fool was a very extreme deity. He had the ability to destroy a star, but he was unable to face it directly. His strengths and weaknesses were equally obvious. In addition, conceptualized objects couldn't directly affect the surrounding environment and harm the enemy. It wasn't enough to write the words immense mass, gravity, high temperatures, high heat, and fusion to create similar effects, but as Mr. Fool, Klein held the authority of fooling. He made his surroundings change according to the concept of a star. This was an intense change, and also a type of fooling. Amon, who was wearing a pointed hat and a classic black robe, was completely ignited under the illumination of the star. He began to vaporize. At this moment, his figure distorted as he was instantly dyed with resplendent starlight. He turned extremely illusory, as though he had transformed into an astral door. At that moment, Amon no longer resembled a physical creature. He was closer to a collective body of the symbols like wandering, astral world tunnel, key, and door. This was the ability of a planeswalker to use the astral world to head to different planets and worlds. They were able to transform themselves into symbols, allowing them to effectively use the astral world. At Sequence O Door stage, the qualitative change in such powers became conceptualized. Amon transformed himself into a concept creature and avoided the damage brought by the star. A figure suddenly appeared behind him. It was Klein, who was wearing a trench coat and a top hat. Almost at the same time, Amon's thoughts slowed down a little. His spirit body threads were grabbed by Klein. Using the chaos brought by the star, Klein dispelled the combination he had with the corresponding concepts, and he secretly grafted the location of both parties and arrived behind Amon. Originally, without the concept of reassembly, the star's influence on the surroundings would immediately stop. However, Klein had fooled time, allowing the effects of the first 2 seconds to linger until now, allowing him to fool Amon. If possible, what Klein wished to do now was to deepen the control of Amon's spirit body threads and turn him into his marionette. However, he knew very well that in the present situation, the probability of success was very low. On the one hand, Amon could withstand damage and steal the spirit body threads back. On the other hand, he might be able to use the connection established between the two of them via the spirit body threads to use a bug and influence Klein and parasitize him. Before he had absolute confidence, Klein didn't want his actions to appear rash. The main goal of capturing Amon's spirit body threads was to give the other party a certain sense of sluggishness. This was a performance of the fooling authority during the stage of transforming into a marionette. And with Klein's present state, he was naturally more willing to choose such a low-level but effective method. This would be less of a burden on him, and it wouldn't seriously affect his mental stability like when he used the authority of fooling. At this moment, apart from Amon, his enemy also included the celestial worthy of heaven and earth for blessings in his body. Of course, Amon was the same. If he didn't suppress the celestial worthy's madness, the latter would have already revived in his body. After creating a brief pause in Amon's thoughts, Klein had 3 choices. The first was to take this opportunity to escape Sapphira Castle, but he wasn't sure if Amon's instincts were still working and would still attempt to stop him from escaping. Second, it was to summon the projections of the historical void, but it wasn't of much use. The effects of an angel-level existence could do little in this battle of gods. It was possible that they couldn't withstand Amon's gaze, much less their historical projections. Even if Klein wanted to use it to transmit information, it lacked sufficient value. The other deities couldn't enter Sapphira Castle and provide help. Third, he could use this opportunity to exert a certain amount of influence on Amon's true body. Without any hesitation, Klein chose the third plan. He wanted to take the opportunity to graft Amon, Sapphira Castle, and the Door of Light that was stained with bluish-black together. Klein felt that Amon's half-crazy state wasn't bad enough. He just appeared rather talkative, with him occasionally not grasping an opportunity. He wanted to make him go crazier. When Amon and Sapphira Castle completed the reassembly, the celestial worthy's will in his body would clearly strengthen, and the chaos in his mind would intensify. That way, Amon would lack the rationality to restrain himself, making his actions more instinctive than being the result of a contemplative thinking process. To Mr. Error, who was an expert at deceit, this would be fatal. Of course, Klein could only maintain this kind of grafting for a second. Exceeding this limit might mean that he would no longer be facing Amon, but the celestial worthy of heaven and earth for blessings. When the time came, the other party would definitely gladly accept the gift of Sapphira Castle. He could then fight Sequenzo the Fool with a Sapphira, 2 uniquenesses, and the corresponding Sequence 1 beyonder characteristics. Originally, Klein could have relied on his fooling authority to reduce Amon's intelligence, but firstly, he wasn't able to use power at this level for a long time in his current state. Secondly, as a dual-pathway true god, and a wielder of many authorities, the duration of the blind stupidity effect on him was rather limited. Therefore, Klein had no choice but to take the risk of grafting things in such a way. And madness would accompany Amon, doing so until he found a new balance or met the best psychiatrist. In the blink of an eye, the translucent, cold mask appeared on Klein's face once again. A strange door of light that was stained with a hint of bluish-black suffused from Amon's body. Sapphira Castle. Chapter 1385 Madness. Amon and the strange door of light were grafted together. His face grimaced as the darkness in his eyes intensified. At the same time, more slippery tentacles appeared under his classic black robe. Fully showcasing the crazy feeling was completely displayed. Just as Klein was preparing to sever the connection between Amon and Sapphira Castle and make him maintain his madness, the corners of Amon's mouth curled up. It was as if he was saying, "Congratulations, you have fallen into a trap." His face was immediately covered with a translucent mask that was similar to the fool's uniqueness, but one that was even more illusory. Klein's mind tensed up, and without a second thought, he immediately used the authority of fooling, without any regard for the consequences. But before he could react, his thoughts slowed down. He was in a dazed state that he didn't know what to do. Fooling. Amon actually used the temporary reassembly between him and Sapphira Castle to escape Klein's interference and activate the power of the fool's domain. Such an action completely exceeded his instincts and was more like a meticulous trap. Amon didn't seem to be crazy enough. This true god of the error and door pathways immediately removed the grafting of himself to Sapphira Castle, allowing the mysterious door that was tainted with hints of bluish-black to quickly fade away to prevent him from being tainted further. After dealing with this latent danger, Amon raised both hands, his thumbs and index fingers touching each other to form an oval. In the oval, starlight lit up, perfectly embracing Klein's figure. Right on the heels of that, Amon's hands suddenly parted to the side as though they were tearing something apart. This seemed to be a heavy task. With the tearing sounds of paper, the area where Klein's body was in seemed to turn into glass. Under the intense impact, countless cracks appeared as they shattered bit by bit. This was a form of regression and the destruction of space. Unable to withstand it at all, Klein's body could only turn into paper fragments that flew in the air as the surrounding void collapsed and shattered. These bits of paper were instantly swallowed up by the darkness. By the time the space collapsed, Klein's paper figurines were almost exhausted. Of course, he also relied on the level and traits of the fool to forcefully escape the effects of blind stupidity. And at this moment, Amon had already split into countless figures. Some of them were purely avatars, some were replicas on the level of symbolism, while others were left behind from constantly blinking. At that moment, the sky above Klein's head and the surrounding wilderness were occupied by almonds. They wore pointed hats and monocles, blocking every single loophole. Some of these almonds transformed into old, mottled bluish-black wall clocks. Some of them turned into pure starlight, as though they were trying to create a cage. Some extended their hands, doing different levels of theft. Some of the monocles glowed as they used various items that they had stolen from the past. Some simulated various abilities, either exerting limitations, interference, or attacks. In the Marauder pathway, theft was a core skill, one of its main symbols. The difference between it and a seer's control of spirit body threads was that, as one advanced through the sequences, not only did its effects and success rate increase, it also obtained a deeper level of conceptualization. At sequence 9 to sequence 7, theft happened on items. At sequence 6, theft happened on beyonder powers. After advancing to sequence 5, theft happened on thoughts and ideas. At sequence 4 and sequence 3, theft became life, including parasitic theft at the physical level. And at sequence 2 level, the range of theft broadened to fate, identity, self-awareness, and beyonder characteristics. As for sequence 1, theft could temporarily happen on time, anchors, and authorities. Therefore, when an error faced a true deity, he could also use theft that had reached the level of authority. With a gong, the ancient wall clocks paused in unison. This caused the surrounding environment to freeze, causing the destroyed wilderness from the sun's blast to become extremely quiet. Even the destruction was frozen. At that moment, Klein seemed to lose his body. All that was left was a translucent dark-colored cloak and a bizarre ice-cold mask. Under the cloak and mask was rich darkness. Nothing could be seen other than the slippery and sinister tentacles that extended out. In such a state, Klein seemed to escape the limitations of time. In a frozen environment, he moved like a fish. Through various cracks in reality or concept, he emerged from the encirclement of the almonds. He once again used his fooling authority. This time, he fooled time. The ancient wall clocks vanished, and in the desolate wilderness that had almost completely collapsed, time returned to its normal flow. The almonds stopped their attempts, suddenly merged into one, and blinked behind Klein, preventing him from having a breather. His left palm reached out, and as he retracted it, he clenched his fingers. Around Klein, the space suddenly became shrouded in shadows, making it look like a thin fishnet veil. The fishnet veil began to twist and reassemble, as though they formed a sufficiently strong cage that trapped Klein inside. An illusory door appeared above the cage as it moved quickly without being fixed in place. However, Klein's figure suddenly appeared outside the cell, as though he had never been sealed by Amon's door authority. He had fooled history and had split his previous and future self. Hence, the one imprisoned in the cell became his historical projection. This was the scholar of Yor's powers deepening under the fooling authority. As he had relied on an advancement ritual based on fooling history, Klein's the fool powers in such a domain were stronger than when he fooled time and fate. As soon as he escaped the spatial cell, Klein immediately used the realm of mysteries to create a new divine kingdom of the fool. This was to stall for time and find a chance to stabilize his mental state. He had used the fooling authority multiple times, and the weak balance in his body was on the verge of collapsing. If he didn't stabilize his mental state as soon as possible, the will of the celestial worthy would awaken further. This was also a serious problem. At this moment, a huge crystal monocle appeared in front of him. On this monocle, layers of sparkling light surged out and flooded him instantly. Klein's mental state suddenly stabilized, but the price was to lose all his emotions and desires. He didn't even want to resist. All he wanted was to stand there quietly and wait for the impending destruction. This was like an ordinary person being injected with a huge dose of anesthetic. At the same time, an illusory book appeared in the layers of light. The book opened, revealing a sentence. Tormented by the Lord of the Mysteries' mental corruption, Klein Moretti had always been in great pain and a state of extreme exhaustion. After the intense battle, he has finally reached his limits due to the influence of his mind. He had decided to give up and stop resisting. Behind the huge crystal monocle, Amon, who was wearing a pointed hat and classic black robe, quickly outlined himself like a mountain. He looked at Klein, who had given up resisting, and his dark eyes turned lighter as the corners of his lips curled up. "I stole it. How is it?" Klein raised his head to look at Mr. Error, and he tried hard to open his mouth. He said weakly, "You were pulling off a deception from the beginning?" Amon raised his hands and said with a smile, "Unfortunately, you realized it too late." He made his thumbs and index fingers touch each other, forming an oval. In the oval, starlight lit up, illuminating Klein's figure. Right on the heels of that, Amon solemnly separated his hands, tearing apart the void where Klein and the surrounding environment relied on to live. The void was like glass, shattering into pieces like the collapse of a skyscraper. However, all the collapsing and destruction circled Klein's body without directly affecting him. He was like a small fishing boat that calmly cruised through a storm. It appeared out of place and disharmonious, as though it didn't seem to belong here. Amon raised his hand and adjusted his monocle on his right eye. The smile on his face somewhat faded. A translucent cloak kept popping up and disappearing over the surface of Klein's body. He looked at the mountain like Amon, his eyes turning darker. From the moment you entered Sapphira Castle and said the first word, you began your deceit. At that time, Amon said that he had taken the risk to release the suppression of the Lord of the Mysteries in his body, in exchange for the identity of Sapphira Castle's owner. At that moment, Amon didn't take the opportunity to continue attacking Klein. He floated in midair and looked down at Mr. Fool. Klein didn't make any attempts either. His tone was strangely calm, as though he was preparing something. If simply releasing the suppression of the Lord of the Mysteries will allows you to enter Sapphira Castle at the cost of being half crazy, Antigonus could have done so back then. The Annihilation demonic wolf, Phlegria, from even earlier could have done it as well. You and Mr. Dorr previously had countless opportunities. Clearly, it's impossible to invade Sapphira Castle by just making the Lord of the Mysteries awaken to a certain extent, and using half-craziness in concert with error. There's no way you can find a usable bug in this matter unless you directly get him to replace you. Only when you possess the door authority to go anywhere did you see hope. By creating a back door and using bugs, you could make Sapphira Castle treat you as the Lord of the Mysteries and give you the corresponding authority. Of course, this will definitely require the awakening of the Lord of the Mysteries to a rather dangerous state. Without this hidden identity, you won't be able to deceive Sapphira Castle without any reason. After absorbing Door's uniqueness, you didn't immediately infiltrate Sapphira Castle to deal with me, who was even weaker back then. It was because at that time, you were unable to completely withstand the awakening of the Lord of the Mysteries' will, with you having just advanced. I believe you've already found a relatively safer solution. If I hadn't advanced to the Fool so quickly, you would have been able to enter Sapphira Castle in the best state to resolve everything sometime later. And now, you have no choice but to bring this plan forward. There's definitely a very serious problem with you. You took the initiative to throw out the price of becoming half crazy to, on the one hand, make me think of countermeasures in this direction so as to lay a deadly trap in key areas, and on the other hand, you also wanted to divert attention and use this opportunity to conceal other problems. You're not half mad at all. Amon quietly listened to Klein's words. Rather abnormally, he didn't interrupt him, nor did he attempt to attack. Only when Klein was done did he say with an odd expression, "You're crazy." Chapter 1386 Narrow Path. Upon hearing Amon's, "You're crazy," Klein raised his head and laughed out loud. "I just gave up according to your arrangements. It's just that it's more complete than you think." As he spoke, an illusory brand appeared on the forehead of the ice-cold and bizarre mask he was wearing. It was a strange door of light that was tainted with bluish blackness. As for Klein, he was also enveloped in something similar. Under the translucent dark-colored cloak, more and more slippery and sinister tentacles appeared. They were densely packed and extended until they occupied the nearby sky. As his dark eyes flashed, Klein looked at Amon and said with a smile, "For me, instead of you becoming the Lord of the Mysteries, wouldn't it be better if we let the past him revive?" After his mental state stabilized and he figured out the key to Amon's surprise attack, Klein's thoughts of giving up removed his resistance towards the Lord of the Mysteries' will in his body, allowing him to further revive. It was precisely because of this that he was able to control Sapphira Castle at critical moments and borrow the power of error to avoid the collapse of the space created by Amon. Without waiting for Amon's response, the corners of Klein's lips curled up as he said with a smile, "After you were corrupted by Sapphira Castle and showed signs of madness, you immediately recovered and could use Sapphira Castle to create the effects of blind stupidity. After releasing the suppression of the Lord of the Mysteries' will in you, you didn't enter a half-crazy state, as there are external powers helping you. You should have an extremely key important avatar. It might even be like Pala's choice to lower his level. It's sleeping at Adam's place, and it allows a visionary like him to personally protect your mental state. As long as the awakening of the Lord of the Mysteries' will doesn't exceed the limits of what Adam can withstand, you won't go crazy here if you don't lose control there. Therefore, your most serious problem is that you have to maintain a normal connection with that body. Once it's interfered with, your condition will be in trouble. And this connection is actually very weak under Sapphira Castle's isolation effect. You deliberately showed a half-crazed state for two reasons. Other than luring me to find an opportunity in this direction and stepping on the trap you set up, you were also hiding this fact so that I won't be able to target this aspect while engaging in a battle with you. Of course, there are plenty of problems outside these ones. After all, you aren't fully prepared. If I had discovered these problems earlier, even if I was a king of angels with a uniqueness, there's no way for me to defeat you. Amon listened quietly and raised his hand to adjust the crystal monocle in his right eye. The corners of his lips curled up as he let out a sigh with a smile. Upon seeing this, Klein smiled and shook his head. You truly are powerful, cunning and terrifying, truly worthy of the title of God of Deceit. If it wasn't for the fact that I had long considered what I would do when forced into a corner by you and had no other choice, I definitely would have hesitated just now. And if I hesitated slightly, I would have already died. In that case, Amon would completely control Sapphira Castle, preventing Klein from returning from the fog of history for a resurrection. Amon stared at the increasing number of sinister tentacles extending out from under Klein's dark-colored cloak. He slowly took a deep breath and said with a smile, "The Lord of the Mysteries in you is about to truly awaken." Klein's smile had a nerve-wracking feeling to it. You can also compete with me on this point. Our next battle is very simple. It's a competition of who awakens the Lord of the Mysteries' will to a greater extent, a competition of whose control over Sapphira Castle is deeper. 50%, 70%, 90%, until we reach 100%. Then with a bang, we explode and he returns. What do you think? Are you going to take the bet? Let's see who can't hold on any longer first. It's very thrilling, very interesting, and very suited to your preferences. It's like the roulette that's popular in Faceac. 2 people, each having a revolver and a bullet inside. They take turns pulling the trigger at their temples. Whoever gives up first results in his opponent winning. And if no one gives up and persists until the end, there won't be a winner. He will be the winner. Amon's brows pricked up as he smiled without saying a word. Klein looked at him and said with a smile, "Although you've always been pursuing thrills and are known to be a risk-taker, you achieve your goals most of the time. Not only do you not lose much, you often gain a lot. And in the few failures that you do experience, you only lose some of your avatars and some items. You've never suffered any serious injuries or been placed in a desperate situation. Your every action is a product of meticulous planning. Even if you fail, you will have a way out. Does this mean that you value your life more than I imagined? You do like thrills and seek it for pleasure, but to do so regardless of the price is just an image you portray. How can a real god of deceit wager a bet with himself at stake? Of course, this is just my own guess. Perhaps it's wrong. Anyway, do you want to take the bet?" Amon stroked the crystal monocle and made a TSK like Medici. "You're really crazy," Klein replied with a smile. "In the eyes of others, this is indeed insane. But to me it's just a choice. Compared to you, I'm more willing to believe in the former Lord of the Mysteries. He is a true great old one, looking down on the universe from high above and treating most of the living beings as insects. This would make him distance himself from reality. Besides, I should still have time to get the genie to be my witness. I'll get the Lord of the Mysteries to promise me certain things. To him, it's very simple and worthless." Having said that, the corners of Klein's mouth curled up as he said, "I won't lose too much, just myself. There are always some things that are more important than others." Amon maintained his smile but didn't say a word. Klein then surveyed the area and found the magic wishing lamp and Trunsoist brass book among the floating fragments of the wilderness. He immediately laughed out loud. "Look, I didn't get punished. This means that I'm not lying. I'm telling the truth." In fact, the laws set up by the Trunsoist brass book had long been abolished since the divine kingdom was destroyed during the star's descent. Later on, the Amons dared to attempt to use steel, but Klein's main goal wasn't to prove anything, but to show his determination, firmness, or perhaps madness. Of course, what he said was the truth. He was indeed willing to put them into practice. Otherwise, there was no way he could hide it from Amon or exert enough pressure on him. Amon smiled and said without a hint of panic, "Sounds interesting." "Isn't it?" "Let's begin," Klein replied without hesitation as his eyes turned darker. Amon's smile froze as his palms suddenly gathered together. Beneath his classical black robe, there were also slippery and sinister tentacles. His aura changed a little as His body seemed to have a dark cloak on it. At that moment, Amon became more like the Lord of the Mysteries. However, he wasn't competing with Klein in the progression of the awakening of the Lord of the Mysteries. Instead, he was using this to deceive Sapphira Castle to create a corresponding bug, and creating a chance to escape. If the authority of the error were to take effect at the same level, it would often have different preconditions. First, the medium and target had to be similar enough. Second, there was a certain connection between the two. Third, there were certain logical contradictions between certain matters or objects. Fourth, some of the rules were indeed incomplete. Fifth, while not directly affecting the target, construct an erroneous environment as a divine kingdom. In this aspect, the restrictions of fooling were even fewer, but once an error satisfied the conditions, it would be difficult to defend against or terminate it. Amon now wanted to take the initiative to disguise himself and satisfy the first category. This was similar to the invasion of a virus. First, it had to make the other party believe that they were on the same side to avoid detection, and then paralyze any defenses to achieve their respective goals. When a fruit looked like a strawberry, smelled like a strawberry, tasted like a strawberry, then it would basically be considered as a strawberry. But in reality, there might be an exception. At this moment, Amon's appearance resembled that of the Lord of the Mysteries. His aura was like the Lord of the Mysteries, and his powers were like the Lord of the Mysteries. His mental imprint was also similar to the Lord of the Mysteries. With the authority of an error, it would naturally make Sapphira Castle believe that he was the Lord of the Mysteries. Suddenly, Klein's damaged the Fool Divine Kingdom completely collapsed. The grand and ancient palace and the model table inside appeared. The grayish-white fog beneath Sapphira Castle rose and enveloped the space. The grayish-white fog split into two waves. They clashed fiercely in a particular spot, producing vortexes one after another. They tore open a gap that led to reality. The power of Sapphira Castle was at odds with itself in this second. It was as though it didn't know which Lord of the Mysteries to obey. Amon's figure immediately vanished, using Dor's authority to rush out of Sapphira Castle. Just as he touched the edge, his body paused before being sent flying backward. At the Fool's seat, the corners of Klein's lips curled up as he sat there. His glabella and the strange door of light around him became more obvious, as though they were corporeal. This released an immense convergence force that reached an unimaginable level. It was like an invisible hand that pulled Amon back. Amon's body suddenly split apart, transforming into countless selves. And in front of every Amon, an illusory astral door appeared. Silently, the astral doors opened at the same time, but in the endless darkness behind the doors, slippery and sinister tentacles appeared, blocking Amon's escape. At the tip of the tentacles, resplendent starlight lit up as they instantly enveloped the almonds. The almonds couldn't help but gather together, turning into a conceptual cluster. These concepts included but weren't limited to pointed hats, classical black robes, monocles, fate, time, keys, doors, bugs, and Trojan horses. Klein slowly stood up and smiled at the conceptualized Amon, who was now in a passive state. You can also awaken the Lord of the Mysteries as well further, but this is different from death. It'll definitely affect the body at Adam's side. A conceptualized Amon rapidly gained a physical form. He relied on the door authority to escape from his current state. The corners of his mouth curled into a smile, but he didn't respond to Klein. He seized this opportunity to use the error authority to deceive. Using an avatar outside that he had prepared ahead of time, it could be used to replace him and swap places with him. This was similar to the swapping of marionettes in the seer domain, but at this level, the principles were different. It wouldn't be affected in most situations. However, Amon still failed. He realized that his error authority had been forcefully suppressed. As Klein slowly got up, more slippery and sinister tentacles appeared around him. The smile on his face became more exaggerated. Right on the heels of that, Amon's eyes glazed over and the smile on his face froze as the crystal monocle lost its luster. At the same time, the cold, bizarre mask on Klein's face squirmed. The blind stupidity effect. In the next second, he grafted himself to a certain concept in the cosmos, and he used his authority to influence the corresponding environment. The surrounding slippery tentacles aimed at Amon, like revolvers. In Amon's eyes that were still glazed over, a supernova exploded. An unimaginable sea of scorching light surged out, shattering his monocle and drowning his body. Chapter 1387 Method Behind the Endless Curtain of Darkness. In the darkness with aqueous light ebbing gently. A young man with black hair, black eyes, a broad forehead, and a thin face suddenly sat up as though he had experienced a nightmare. Dressed in a classic black robe, he stretched out his right hand, attempting to take out a crystal monocle from the void and wear it over his right eye. But this time, he didn't obtain anything. His right hand paused in midair for 2 seconds before he retracted it and pinched the right eye rim. At this moment, he heard a gentle but emotionless voice. To him, there's something more important than life. To you, apart from yourself, there's nothing worth caring about. When the matter develops to a point where one's life is put on the line, it would imply your loss. The corners of Amon's mouth curled up as though he wanted to smile and reply, but he ultimately didn't say anything. The voice continued, born as a mythical creature, your lack of normal anchors is also a problem. This makes you know what courage and sacrifice are, but it's hard for you to understand. Amon's expression changed as he stood up from the slightly glistening darkness. He looked at the human-skinned glove that was thrown to the side before but seemed to be very happy. He retracted his gaze and curled the corners of his lips. This seems very interesting. I plan to leave this place and enter the cosmos. That place is much more exciting than the real world. Perhaps I'll understand the 2 things you mentioned as a result of this. That's very dangerous. Once you enter the cosmos, and before I succeed, I won't be able to provide any help. However, this will let you avoid him at least. The calm and indifferent voice replied without any emotion. Amon didn't say another word. He raised his hand and pinched his right eye rim and vanished from the endless shadow screen. In the ancient palace above the fog, as Amon was completely obliterated under the power of a supernova, Klein couldn't help but heave a sigh of relief. If he had a choice, he naturally didn't want to sacrifice himself to revive the celestial worthy of heaven and earth for blessings. He hoped to personally protect this world and seek out the meaning of life again. Of course, if he didn't have a choice, he wouldn't hesitate to awaken the celestial worthy. He was certain that he could do this, and Amon was also aware of this. Therefore, he didn't force him, and only attempted to escape. In the battle just now, it had developed into a battle of courage towards the end. The one who wasn't afraid of true death would yield the absolute advantage. Clearly, Amon wasn't prepared to sacrifice himself for this matter. After heaving a sigh of relief, Klein's face under the cold and bizarre mask suddenly grimaced. Under his translucent dark-colored cloak, the slippery and sinister tentacles that extended out were either hitting the ground or rising up high. It was completely out of his control. He could feel that the celestial worthy of heaven and earth for blessings in his body was rapidly waking up, and it seemed like he couldn't stop it. Even if Klein directly died with his will and relied on the powers of a miracle invoker to revive, he wouldn't be able to escape, as the Lord of the Mysteries also wielded the authority of miracles. At that moment, Klein recalled the words of Dark Angel Sasrar, which was also from the ancient sun god. The primordial one had awoken in my body. In the next second, at the spot where Amon's body had shattered, beams of light were pulled by a vague invisible form of gravity as they charged towards Klein. Some were worms of time with 12 rings, some were insects made of resplendent starlight, while some were just large numbers of light dots. Klein wanted to stop the Beyonder characteristics from fusing with him, but the increasingly powerful celestial worthies prevented him from succeeding. His body swelled into a balloon, and then suddenly became thin as paper. This repeated itself in an endless loop. The mask on his face became brighter and more bizarre. The slippery and evil tentacles that extended out from under his cloak increased and became more uncontrollable. One worm of time Beyonder characteristic, one key of star Beyonder characteristic, and one. Klein's mind felt like he was being devoured by an invisible monster, producing excruciating pain. Finally, a pair of eyes, which seemed to be formed from pure starlight, formed from layers of illusory doors and crystal monocles, rushed towards Klein's face, straight for the mask's eye sockets. Almost at the same time, the strange door of light that was tainted with bluish blackness appeared on Klein's body again. Sapphira Castle. At that moment, Klein, Sapphira Castle, Door's uniqueness, and Error's uniqueness, all had a strong inclination to congregate. Once they fused together, the Lord of the Mysteries would completely awaken and complete his resurrection process. Klein suddenly used his right hand to cover half of his face. His entire body bent down as if he was fighting with another self. With the anchoring and image disruption from his anchors, Klein finally slowed down the awakening of the Lord of the Mysteries' will, reducing the power of convergence by a little. The starlight eyes and the crystal monocle stopped in front of Klein's face, floating only a few centimeters in the air like planets revolving around the sun. Klein believed that he couldn't maintain this extreme imbalance for too long. Perhaps a few minutes or even dozens of seconds later, the convergence would continue without restraint, bringing about an unbearable change. Haha, this can be considered a form of fusion. Klein laughed in an unstable manner. Then he fooled the Trunsoist brass book, allowing it to enter a sealed state and fly into the junk pile. Right on the heels of that, Klein left Sapphira Castle and arrived in the astral world formed from symbolism and authority. This place seemed similar to the cosmos. It was dark and vast, but in fact, there were many unique aspects to it. For example, even though there was a sun-like star hanging in the distance, emitting normal light and heat, if one tried to get close to it, without getting injured, one would realize that the astral world there was like a black curtain. The sun was directly painted with pastel colors, and there were a bunch of concepts and symbols surrounding it. Furthermore, the drawing of the sun wasn't that nice, like a child without any foundation in art casually scrawled about. It was both comical and frightening. From another perspective, this might be a manifestation of the chaos and madness that underlay everything. As soon as Klein entered, he immediately sensed invisible gazes. Some of them came from areas protected by the world barrier, while others came from broader areas with obvious malice. The corners of Klein's mouth couldn't help but curl up. He suddenly turned his head and looked outside the world barrier, raising his slippery and sinister tentacles. This pair of eyes that seemed forged from starlight and the crystal monocle also moved. All of a sudden, all the attention from the cosmos shrank back. Only the hand-drawn crimson moon was left hanging there as it flashed with light. Ha ha! Klein laughed as he came to a dark kingdom filled with night vanilla and slumber flowers. At the same time, the Evernight goddess appeared at the borders of the divine kingdom in a layered, star-speckled dress. Her face was covered in a translucent black veil. She didn't transform into her giant form as she looked at him at eye level before raising her right hand and revealing the bird-shaped, golden accessory. At the head of the bird-shaped, golden accessory, a series of illusory doors appeared in the bronze-like eyes, allowing a drop of colorless water that had a strong aura of eternal stillness to land on Klein's cold and bizarre mask. The will of the celestial worthy of heaven and earth for blessings entered a state of eternal slumber. Likewise for a majority of Klein's consciousness. All he had was a tiny bit of lucidity. Under such circumstances, he made the mask retract, and he transformed the cloak into a black windbreaker. Then, he made the crystal monocle turn into a pair of black gloves, making the eyes forged from starlight to turn into a cane inlaid with star speckles. This was only a change in appearance, but it didn't change anything in reality. Once the two items were separated from Klein, they would return to their original state. Of course, if Klein stabilized himself, he could accommodate them and change their corresponding concepts and symbols over and over again, allowing them to change their forms forever. This can't be sustained for too long. It just delays the matter for a while. The Evernight goddess gently reminded him. If the river of eternal darkness's water is used repeatedly, the Lord of the Mysteries will awaken even faster. This is because he will trigger some unknown changes and adjust his condition. Similarly, the specialness of Sapphira Castle and my blessing will gradually be erased, allowing you to enter a state of eternal slumber. It was as though Klein wasn't discussing his own matters. He smiled and nodded. Got it. The Evernight goddess said in a tone that seemed to be comforting Klein's psyche. Regarding this matter, the method Amon used, and the actions he did had exceeded my expectations. He is indeed the true god of deceit. It's not that you have no chance at all in what comes next. You can first try to completely control Sapphira Castle, and pull the will of the Lord of the Mysteries to enter a state of eternal slumber. In the dream, you can resist and fuse with him. I can bless you, but the most important thing is still left to you. Becoming a great old one doesn't have any rituals involved. No ritual can change the awakening of the primordial one's will, but the ancient sun god believes that the order to accommodate them can increase one's self-awareness to a certain extent, increasing the success rate of the matter. First become a sequence 0 of a pathway, then control and fuse with the Sapphira. Only then do you accommodate the other uniquenesses. That's the best order. Become a dual pathway true god and then controlling and fusing with the Sapphira is an order that isn't good or bad. Only fusing with the Sapphira at the final step will be the worst choice. Klein smiled and said, "That's a good idea. As long as one wakes up, a Lord of the Mysteries will be born. This might be him. Or me. Yes, after completely controlling Sapphira Castle and entering a state of eternal slumber, I should be able to weaken the seal of the Western continent, creating a weak spot that allows one to enter and exit." The Evernight goddess didn't say a word when she heard Klein's words. Klein continued smiling. "This is my choice. I had anticipated this day a long time ago. I will finally face him." Chapter 1388. A sudden gathering. The Evernight goddess nodded and didn't say anything else. She reached out her palm and grabbed a corner of the void and tugged lightly. A thin layer of a night curtain gently floated down, covering Klein's body as it silently seeped in. Klein silently took in the blessings from the dream for 2 seconds. He pressed his hand to his chest and bowed. He took 2 steps back and left the astral world. The Evernight goddess stood at the borders of the divine kingdom as she watched him leave. In the next second, Klein landed in the projection of the giant king's court in the ruins of the Battle of Gods. Then, like a mon, he walked to the edge of the grayish-blue door and raised his hand to create a blue illusory door. Through the door, Klein entered the forsaken land of the gods. Following the guidance of fate, he wandered straight to the peak of a mountain range. There was a huge crucifix erected there, one covered with a faint shadow. Klein stared at the shadow for a few seconds before sighing slightly. He bent down and picked up an ancient silver mirror that was placed near the huge cross. Then, he turned around and vanished from the forsaken land of the gods. At the same time, the Worms of Spirit, who didn't need to be on duty in Sapphira Castle, informed him of Queen Mystic's current location. Klein raised his hand and took out the magic wishing lamp from the junk pile. Using the ownership connection between it and Bernadette, he used another wandering to appear on a rather hidden island where Emerald City was. Bernadette was flipping through the latest album catalog from Intis. Just as she sensed something, she saw Gehrman Sparrow hand her the magic wishing lamp. "Thank you," Klein said in a very normal voice. Bernadette pursed her lips as though she wanted to say something, but at that moment, her eyes flashed as though she had seen something and prophesied something. Hence, she silently reached out and took the magic wishing lamp. Klein then took out a metal cigar case that had signs of corrosion on its surface. "This is your payment." Even without the eye of mystery prying, Bernadette could sense that the iron cigar case was extraordinary. She could roughly guess what kind of corrosion had happened to it. However, she didn't choose to accept it because of that reason, but she suddenly felt that she had no reason to reject it. She hesitated for a moment before taking the iron cigar case. If he was still in a rather crazy state like before, Klein definitely would have smiled and said in an exaggerated manner the moment Bernadette hesitated, "This is a gift from Uncle. Take it." But now, he was only left with that last bit of lucidity. He had to put in a lot of effort to prevent himself from falling asleep and not having the impulse to act like a clown. After leaving Bernadette's Emerald City, Klein seized the opportunity to wander to Backlund, to Dr. Aaron Sirius's home. Willa Septon, who was sitting in a pile of toys, raised his head and looked at Dwayne Dantes in front of him. His tears suddenly streamed down as he choked. "I finally feel the opportunity." He was referring to the opportunity for accommodating the Fate Pathway's uniqueness. Klein squatted down and said without any expression, "I am here to help you accommodate it. I'll steal your childhood and youth and allow you to instantly grow up. Then, by relying on a level of above the sequences but below that of a great old one, I'll forcefully help you to accommodate the die of probability. Of course, that alone won't be enough. It will require an additional fooling and use of a bug." The tears that Willa Septon dripped down suddenly stopped. He muttered in astonishment, "So the two choices are actually the same." Typically speaking, the accommodation of a pathway's uniqueness required one to be naturally born with it, seek an existence at the level of a great old one to help, or rely on a simplified advancement ritual to complete it. There was no other possibility. The Snake of Fate, Willa Septon, clearly wasn't born with the uniqueness, and only had the two options left to consider. His focus had been on holding a simplified ritual, which was to wait for the opportunity of fate. Who knew that this opportunity was actually when Klein was approaching the level of a great old one? In essence, it was the second method. With this in mind, the chubby child, Willa Septon, cried even harder. He felt as though he had been deceived by fate. Let the life school of thought's demigods send over the die of probability. Normally, with your luck, The die of probability should be by your side. Klein ignored Will's crying. Let's begin as soon as possible. I don't have much time left. Will stopped and looked at Klein for a moment before he said, slightly choking, forget it, let's wait for the next opportunity. Given your current state, it would be a huge burden for you to forcibly help me accommodate it. Perhaps you would lose control on the spot. I don't want to face the Lord of the Mysteries. Okay, next time. I have a premonition. With that said, Will looked into Klein's eyes and said, I have a feeling that the next opportunity will be better. Klein maintained his reverie-like expression as he said in a low voice, is this a prophecy? Will Septon's tears flowed again. No, it's a blessing. Klein nodded slightly, stood up, and took a step back. During this process, his figure gradually faded away and soon disappeared. He returned to Sapphira Castle and sat on the high-back chair, allowing the grayish-white fog to envelop him. After surveying the area and confirming the states of the crimson stars, Klein leaned back in his chair in exhaustion and slightly raised his right hand. This time, he didn't create the fake world again. On the two sides of the long mottled table, crimson beams of light shot out at the same time, freezing into the members of the Tarot Club, the Hanged Man, the Sun, the Hermit, the Magician, and the rest. This sudden gathering was clearly beyond Audrey's and company's expectations. It left them surprised and alarmed. Before that, although they had come to Mr. Fool's Divine Kingdom on occasions that weren't a Monday afternoon, it was all planned. They knew in advance that they would be dragged here. They would have either applied for a mini-gathering in advance, avoid the full moon ravings, or treat Mr. World with psychological problems. It could be said that, apart from the first time, this was the second time they were summoned by Mr. Fool without any warning. This made even the slowest members of the club catch the hint of uneasiness and feel the air freeze. Thinking back to the World Gairman Sparrow's visit and the words of Mr. Fool's blessed, Audrey, Alger, and Zio simultaneously had similar thoughts. Is it finally here? Audrey subconsciously turned her head and looked down at the bottom end of the long mottled table. There was no one there. Although she was already mentally prepared, Audrey couldn't help but be stunned as emotions of uncontrollable sadness surged within her. In her heart, the World Gairman Sparrow's image had long since turned from a crazy adventurer and an extremely dangerous beyonder to a person who wore a cold and tough facade but was a gentle, powerful, loving, mysterious, and lonely man who was burdened with many friends on his back. She believed that amongst the Tarot Club members, she knew the world the best apart from Mr. Star. And now, this friend seemed to have encountered some misfortune, leaving behind only an empty seat. The Tarot Club lost its first official member. Where did Klein go? Leonard suddenly felt a little flustered. In this world, he was the only one he could befriend. Previously, when Klein suddenly appeared in the southern continent and threw the gold coin into the cathedral's donation box, Leonard had already had a strange premonition. He had the feeling that Klein was about to receive the judgment of fate and was bidding farewell to the past. This was the same as the time back in Tingen when they decided to step out together and face Magos. Old man's recent silence has been a little bizarre. Could something really have happened to Klein? With Mr. Fool's level and status, as long as there's a chance, he should be able to be saved. Leonard's heart tightened as he suddenly turned his body and cast his gaze at Mr. Fool at the top end of the long mottled table. This mighty existence was still enveloped by the grayish-white fog, preventing others from seeing his condition. At this moment, Emlyn, Katlia, and Derek also discovered Mr. World's absence. Coupled with the suddenness of this gathering, they were both shocked and puzzled. They didn't know what had happened, but their instincts told them that it wasn't a good thing. As a clairvoyant who had recently advanced, Katlia even felt that there was a certain problem with Mr. Fool. Mr. World isn't here. Zio had previously mentioned that Mr. Fool and his few blessed were about to face a major challenge, and it's very likely that they would suffer a bad fate. Furs was also somewhat alarmed, inevitably having a strong fear due to some unknown change. She had once thought that she would sigh in relief because of Mr. World's disappearance, but from the looks of it, it wasn't like that. Instead, she found her heart heavy and a little horrified. Only then did she realize that at some point in time, the world had become the pillar of support for the Tarot Club outside of Mr. Fool. It made everyone feel at ease when they saw him. Of course, some fear was unavoidable. As Justice Audrey and company turned around and looked at the top end of the long mottled table, Klein, who was already the real fool, said in a low voice, "This is a last-minute gathering. Mr. Fool is very exhausted." Audrey, who sensed this, felt her heart tighten. She looked around and stood up as usual. After the members of the tarot club stood up one after another, Audrey lifted the ends of her skirt with a heavy heart and curtsied at the end of the long mottled table. "Good afternoon, Mr. Fool." Chapter 1389 The Fool's Commission. Good afternoon, Mr. Fool. The other members of the tarot club appeared rather solemn as they followed Miss Justice's usual greeting. After they sat down again, the Fool Klein surveyed the area and slowly said, "I will be entering a state of slumber." Upon hearing this, Alger, Audrey, Zio, and Furs felt like their speculations had finally been confirmed. Leonard, Emlyn, Derek, and the other tarot club members felt their hearts sink as they became increasingly flustered and filled with puzzlement. Of course, they weren't that surprised. The abnormal last-minute gathering and the abnormality of the world's absence seemed to indicate that something important had happened today. Klein maintained his last bit of clarity and said in his previous tone, "This involves a war that's at the level of above the sequences. It has something to do with the apocalypse to a certain extent." Indeed. Alger acutely caught the words, "above the sequences." He had long suspected that there was another level above sequence 0. The one occupied by the ancient sun god when he had 8 kings of angels. Now, Mr. Fool had finally confirmed his guess and resolved many of his doubts. Katlia and company also noticed the hidden message in Mr. Fool's words. Those who had similar guesses like the Hanged Man felt enlightened, while the ones who had never had such guesses were inevitably surprised and confused when they heard it. However, they quickly combined what they had learned from the past and came to a realization. The Fool Klein continued, "Only after you become an angel do you have the right to know the exact situation. Otherwise, just understanding it will bring corruption." This made the Tarot Club members think of the words underground and cosmos. They were momentarily unable to contain their thoughts. Klein looked at the end of the long mottled table and said, "My blessed, the world has entered a deep slumber. It's unknown when he will wake up. Then what should be done?" Leonard nearly blurted out, but he could clearly sense that Mr. Fool hadn't finished his sentence. Therefore, he forcefully held back his urge. The Fool Klein swept his gaze across him. "Next is a long-term commission for all members. Spread my name more widely, but don't clash with the Orthodox churches. When necessary, you can choose to use a more concealed method to proselytize. This will aid in my awakening. Also spread the news of the world being my blessed, and record it in the church's Holy Bible. Of course, do not include information that involves his personal information. Remember one sentence: the awakening of the world spells the fool's return." Klein wanted to increase his number of anchors. This might be useful in the battle with the Lord of the Mysteries in his dream. At the same time, he wanted to mold the world into a saint of the Church of the Fool, an angel beside the divine throne, so that this image could also greatly share an image with the believers and obtain his own anchors. To put it simply, Klein planned on having a believer contribute 2 sets of anchors. After all, to him, be it the fool or the world, all of them were just an identity of his. Furthermore, the image created by anchors wouldn't be uniform. They were different and wouldn't affect him. At the level of the fool, the church would spread the name of the deity, the fool's sacred emblem, and all kinds of religious teachings without any concrete images. As for the world, he had quite a number of identities, such as Gehrman Sparrow, Dwayne Dantes, and Merlin Hermes. It wouldn't fixate on a single image. The reward is the convenience you have enjoyed in the past, the responses you received, and the corresponding help given to your future prayers, the Fool Klein said without a change in tone. After I begin my slumber, I can still respond to my prayers in a certain way, but not every time. If there's something very important that needs help, pray a few more times. He could tell from Antigonus's state of eternal slumber that dreams could be projected outside. As long as the correct method was used, a sleeping deity could make use of the dream to a certain extent to respond to prayers. Regarding this situation, the members of the Tarot Club weren't stumped by it at all. On the one hand, most of them were either openly or secretly spreading the faith of the fool. On the other hand, it was very common to pray to deities without receiving a response. Mr. Fool's responses from before were considered extremely rare. They had almost never heard of anything like this happening elsewhere. To be able to receive a response through repeated prayers on important matters was better than most of the clergymen of the Orthodox churches. Yes, Mr. Fool. The Tarot Club members didn't hesitate at all as they accepted the long-term commission. Among them, Leonard was the one that answered from the bottom of his heart. He was most eager and impatient. To him, spreading the faith and biblical canon of Mr. Fool was to awaken Klein. This made him instantly find the motivation to do something else other than his usual work. At this moment, the Fool Klein nodded slightly and cast his gaze at Katlia. The previous commission, to gather all the information regarding the hidden sage suddenly coming to life, is still effective. If you wish to take the risk, then go further and investigate the present state of the hidden sage. This will be very dangerous. You can reject it, and the reward is a wish. Katlia thought for a moment and said, Honorable Mr. Fool, is this related to awakening you? Is it related to surviving the apocalypse? Perhaps, perhaps not. I can't give you a definite answer right now. I just see some visions. This time, Klein didn't deliberately create a high-level persona of the Fool, because he was already the Fool. Also, watch over all your subordinates that are beyonders of the Earth and Moon pathway. Katlia fell silent for a moment before slowly saying, I'll accept this commission. The Fool Klein cast his gaze to the other side and said to Derek, Your mission is to protect the new city of Silver and New Moon City and protect the Rorstad archipelago. The more believers I have and the safer they are, the higher the chances of me waking up. On this foundation, think about how to expand the church and spread the faith. Your payment is to become my blessed. Derek's eyes suddenly burned as he recalled the encouraging gaze he had received from the chief when he pushed open the final door of the giant king's court. He took a deep breath and said in a firm tone, Yes, Mr. Fool. Klein nodded and looked at Furs. You need to protect the Abraham family well to prevent them from suffering the temptation of the cosmos. Also, gather more information regarding the fourth epoch and figure out Mr. Door's condition at that time. Uncover some of the latent problems of the Abraham family. That's something I wish to do. Furs hesitated for a moment, but she still expressed that she would do such things even if she wasn't given the commission. The Fool Klein didn't give his approval or disapproval. Instead, he said, If you're willing, you can write down biographies and stories of the world's different identities using different aliases. The reward for above is that when you have a chance of becoming a planeswalker and have to head to the cosmos, you will receive my blessings. Although Klein knew that he could use a dream to give a response to a certain extent in his sleep, he wasn't sure if he was the one who had the upper hand or the Lord of the Mysteries. Therefore, he wished to use verbal contracts of providing a reward after the completion of a mission on more important matters. When the time came, even if he was at a disadvantage, he would be able to make use of this sort of invisible promise to give an ingenious response. Planeswalker? Furs was taken aback. To be frank, she had never considered this problem before. What she was worried about was the digestion of the secret sorcerer potion and the Wanderer ritual. Soon she composed herself and said, Yes, Mr. Fool. Klein then cast his gaze at Emlyn. The besiegement of the Rose School of Thought involves preparations for the apocalypse. It's rather dangerous. Even if an angel is participating in it, you have to pay attention to your own safety. Your commission is to try your best to gather blessings, auras, and items given by the primordial moon to her believers in the Rose School of Thought. These might be more dangerous than a Grade 1 sealed artifact. At that moment, although Klein still maintained the fool's tone, there were hints that resembled a friend's warning. There were no clues to the corresponding Red Priest uniqueness at the moment. The last time the mysterious world knew of it was at the end of the fourth epoch, during the Pale Disaster. 1390 Questions and Answers. Zio had always been looking forward and uneasy as to what her mission was. She looked forward to it because she had already chosen to accept Mr. Fool's gift, so she definitely had to pay the corresponding price. Knowing the mission earlier allowed her to prevent unnecessary second-guessing due to the unknown, guesses that only led to greater fear. She was uneasy because she knew that the remuneration she received was too generous. She believed that the final mission wouldn't be simple and would definitely be filled with danger. At that moment, after hearing Mr. Fool's words, her heart finally settled. At the same time, she secretly heaved a sigh of relief. Investigating the 3-sequence 1 Beyonder characteristics and the uniqueness of the Red Priest pathway and their locations, and even confirming the present state of the primordial demoness was indeed very dangerous. It was a mission that would result in a terrifying corruption if she wasn't careful, but it was at least better than snatching the uniqueness and sequence 1 Beyonder characteristics or directly facing the primordial demoness. If it were the latter, even with the official factions supporting her, Zio didn't think that she could accomplish it. All she could do was write a will, ready to sacrifice herself at any moment. And if it was just the former, she could use a more roundabout method to obtain the information. She didn't need to encounter powerful existences with high statuses. As a Sequence 4 demigod, Xiao was confident. Without any hesitation, she immediately replied, "Yes, Mr. Fool." The Fool Klein had planned on looking to the other side. After some consideration he added, "Be careful of Bansi." Without waiting for the Tarot Club members to start making connections, Klein said to Leonard, "Your mission is similar to the moon's. During the besiegement of the Rose School of Thought, gather blessings, auras, and items from the Mother Tree of Desire from their members. It's equally dangerous." He only gave a single warning, without saying as much as he did like when he gave Emlyn the mission. This was because Leonard had a senior angel from the Marauder pathway, parasitizing him. He knew many secrets and knew how dangerous the outer deities were. He wouldn't allow Leonard to act recklessly. Seeing that Leonard was about to nod, the Fool Klein maintained his tone and continued, "You don't have to do too much in promoting my name. You can even choose not to do it." As one of the 22 high-ranking members of the Church of Evernight, as one of the few high-ranking deacons of the Nighthawks, it was very easy for something to happen if Leonard spread the faith of the Fool in private. He would be misunderstood by his colleagues and cause unnecessary conflicts. Miraculously to Klein, the Moon Emlyn's actions didn't seem to be misunderstood in the same way. To the people in Sanguine around him, anything he did wasn't too strange. That's right. Leonard had already recovered from his previous eagerness and realized the cruelty of reality. However, he still wanted to do something. At this moment, the Fool Klein added, "You can share the stories of the world with songs and poetry." Songs and poetry. Leonard instinctively frowned. He didn't immediately respond to Mr. Fool. Klein then said, "Other than that, try your best to raise your own level to prepare for the apocalypse. The reward for all the missions is a wish." Although many Beyonder characteristics had fallen into the real world when the god of combat died, bringing with them a batch of Beyonder creatures, mutated monsters, and abnormal lands, Klein didn't know how many Sequence 1 Beyonder characteristics the Evernight goddess had obtained from the warrior pathway other than the uniqueness, but at the very least, a number of the Sequence 2 angels of the Church of Evernight had the possibility of becoming a Sequence 1 angel. At the same time, if they had obtained additional Beyonder characteristics, they could still switch to the corresponding sequence of the death pathway. This would open a path for the saints to advance, not limiting them to just one pathway. Of course, not every Sequence 3 saint wished to become an angel, but Leonard was currently only a Sequence 4 Night Watcher. Furthermore, if the corresponding Sequence 3 Horror Bishop position was limited, he could consider Silver Knight and Ferryman. Klein had one set of the former. Leonard fell silent for 2 seconds before he slowly exhaled. "Yes, Mr. Fool." The Fool Klein immediately cast his gaze at Miss Justice, who had been waiting. "Apart from promoting my name, you have 2 missions. One is to assist Judgment and investigate the whereabouts of the Red Priest pathway's uniqueness and Sequence 1 Beyonder characteristics, confirming the present state of the primordial demoness. The other is to work hard to raise your level. One of the missions is to increase my sequence." Audrey was somewhat puzzled about this mission. In her opinion, this seemed to be telling an ordinary person, "Your mission is to earn even more money." Furthermore, this isn't of any value to Mr. Fool. Could it be that he wants me to treat Mr. World? Just as this thought flashed across Audrey's mind, the Fool Klein added, "The higher your sequence, the more opportunities you have to awaken the world. In this aspect, you can make use of external forces to help. The psychology alchemists that Hermes rebuilds will be one of the choices, but you need to be careful and take precautions. You have to pay a certain price for this. You can give up the reward you received before. This depends on your will and thoughts." Audrey no longer had any doubts. After a moment of silence, she nodded solemnly. "Yes, Mr. Fool." Klein's gaze landed on Alger. "You will know what your mission is in time to come." Klein had already foreseen the corresponding scene. Without waiting for Alger to speak, he continued, "You can bring the Sea God's scepter, but during this period of time, all the prayers of the Sea God believers will be transferred to the sun," directly pointing at me. Although Alger still couldn't accurately guess what his mission was, he already had a vague premonition. After a moment of thought, he replied in an upright manner, "Yes, Mr. Fool." Klein retracted his gaze and looked around before slowly saying, "After this, on the first Monday afternoon of every month, you can still gather here, but there will be no convener. If you need to do a private mini-discussion, pray in advance and wait for a response. At this point, the fool Klein closed his eyes and said, "Let us end today's gathering here." The Tarot Club members couldn't help but feel a baffling sense of sorrow. It was as though a grand ball was coming to an end. They stood up at the same time and solemnly bowed towards the end of the long mottled table. "Your will is our will." Klein waited until they finished speaking before he dispelled his control of them. He watched as the crimson starlight scattered and quickly fell. After staring at the scene for a few seconds, he conjured a yellowish parchment and a dark red fountain pen. After some thought, Klein simply wrote, "Dear Mr. Isaac, due to some complicated reasons, I might be sleeping for a long time. I'm sorry, but I might not be able to write a letter to you for a long time." With just that sentence, Klein stopped and made the pen disappear. Although he had conjured that piece of paper, with his current status level and strength, he could sustain it for more than 100 years, even if it was brought to the outside world. He closed his eyes again, summoned Isaac's copper whistle, and blew it. At the same time, he released some of the restrictions that came from Sapphira Castle. The skeleton messenger appeared, and every bone in its body trembled intensely as if it would collapse at any moment. If not for the letter that Klein had handed over, it might have prostrated itself. After the skeleton messenger received the letter and left Sapphira Castle in a hurry, Klein rubbed his temples. This wasn't because the will of the celestial worthy had already escaped from his state of eternal slumber, nor was it because of the pain from maintaining his lucidity. It was just a habit. Klein slowly leaned back into his chair and sighed. On both sides of the long, mottled table, Justice Audrey, the Hanged Man Alger, the Sun Derek, the Magician Furs, the Moon Emlyn, the Hermit Catlia, the Star Leonard, and Judgment Zio appeared in the order they joined the Tarot Club. But this time they weren't real. They were only projections. They no longer appeared blurry, revealing their images from Klein's memory. Soon after, more figures appeared. They were a mature man with a receding hairline with deep eyes, a beautiful witch with blue eyeshadow and red blush, a middle-aged man with black hair mixed with silver hair, his voice unusually loud and sonorous, a woman in her late 40s with ear-length short hair, a youth that gamed on his phone while eating delicacies, a happy young lady who kept giggling, a civil servant who looked old in his age with a high hairline, a young girl dressed in an old-fashioned skirt who focused on machinery, a doll-like lady with a pale face, a teacher with soft facial features and bronze skin, a child licking on ice cream, a madam holding 4 heads, and an elder looking all serious at a bill. They either sat or stood, gathering beside the people they knew. In the flickering candlelight on the long table, they discussed different things, followed the music, and danced. Klein silently watched the lively scene as his expression gradually softened. After an unknown period of time, he stood up, passed through them, and walked into the depths of this space. Behind him, the figures, the candlelight, and the music faded away and disappeared. When he saw the strange door of light above the grayish-white cloud, Klein beckoned for the magic mirror, a Rhodes. At that moment, the transparent or opaque worms and insects that clustered together to form spherical lights in the strange door of light turned bluish-black. It was like a thick layer of fog that made one unable to see what was behind the door. After Klein arrived, he didn't immediately enter. He felt as though there was an extremely terrifying monster behind the door, waiting to devour him. He raised his head and looked at the transparent cocoons hanging above the door of light. He looked at the modern humans with different skin colors inside the cocoons. Closing his eyes to sense them, Klein raised his right hand and closed his 5 fingers. The cocoons cracked open as the people inside transformed into specks of light. They flew out of Sapphira Castle and landed in the real world, into the bodies of those who had just died. After doing this, Klein lowered his head and looked at the magic mirror in his hand. "Are you scared?" The aqueous light on the surface of the ancient silver mirror swirled and the pale words outlined itself. "No." In the next second, a Rhodes raised his own question according to the rules. "Great Master, are you afraid?" The corners of Klein's mouth twitched. "Yes." With that said, he took a step forward with the magic mirror in hand and walked towards the bluish-black fog in the middle of the strange door of light, passing through it. His figure disappeared behind the door that had the unknown hidden behind. The cracked cocoons were still gently swaying. Chapter 1391. Facing eye in the dark blue waves that seemed to never stop in the berserk sea, the future was like a leaf, being thrown high up at times and smacking down at other times. In these waters, there were still some pirate ships that were cruising. They were used to such situations and felt that it was as natural as the sun rising. After Katlia returned to the real world, she pondered for a moment before spreading open a piece of paper and writing. She wanted to ask the Queen what happened recently. In fact, before Mr. Fool announced that he would enter deep sleep, Katlia had already sensed the impending monumental change. Whether it was the sudden closing of the doors or the meteor shower streaking across the sky to illuminate the world, it gave her some inspiration as a clairvoyant, allowing her to see some blurry visions. Of course, she was limited by her own level, position, and status. She didn't have enough knowledge of what had happened, and she was unable to grasp what exactly had caused Mr. Fool to choose to sleep. All she could do was ask Queen Mystic Bernadette, who had long advanced to the level of an angel and led a mysterious organization while being in control of many powerful sealed artifacts. Just as Katlia summoned the messenger and took out the letter she had written, she was taken aback. At that moment, a purple light was accentuated in her eyes. It became extremely saturated and slowly flowed like a river. She felt that Mr. Fool had entered a deep sleep. Unconcealable hesitation, confusion, and sadness arose in the Admiral of Star's heart. For some reason, she felt an inexplicable palpitation, and 2 drops of tears unknowingly slid down her face. She seemed to understand something, yet nothing. She only knew that it was unknown how much time it would take for Mr. Fool to wake up from his slumber. Taking off the heavy glasses on her nose bridge, Katlia wiped the corners of her eyes, allowing her emotions to return to normal. She walked to the window and looked at the deck. Frank Lee warmly invited the crew to taste his newly brewed beer, but none of the pirates dared to try it. Thankfully, I sent Sealf to the Queen ahead of time. Now, all I need to do is watch over Frank. Without Mr. Fool's watch, I have to be more careful and pay more attention to him. Yes, I have to find something for Frank to do other than research. He's a first mate, so he can't always be working on something else. Katlia thought with a heavy expression. After considering how to deal with Frank, as well as how to reorganize the small number of pirates from the Earth and Moon pathway onto other ships, and not frequently interact with Frank, Katlia focused her focus on the hidden sage. Although she was already one of the 10 pillars of the Moses ascetic order, due to her background and the influence of the hidden sage, she had never received the trust of the president and the other higher-ups. She could only be an ostracized person who teetered on the periphery of the organization, who had her own circle and respective faction. From a certain perspective, her relationship with the Moses ascetic order was closer to that of a partner. On the one hand, she needed a faction and a powerhouse to project her will over the 5 seas. On the other hand, she yearned to obtain corresponding knowledge and materials. And to obtain the information regarding the hidden sage that represented a deity suddenly coming to life and confirming his current state would necessarily require her to become a core member of the Moses ascetic order. With my present identity, there's no problem with me participating in the internal decisions of the Moses ascetic order. Only by truly participating in these will I be able to come into contact with more information and elevate my own status. However, this will be rather dangerous. Even if the hidden sage's condition isn't right, and doesn't interfere with the Moses ascetic order's operations, the other higher-ups will also be subjected to the infringement of interests and be in constant suspicion. They will counterattack to a certain degree. There are at least 2 of the 10 pillars that I can't see through, making me instinctively feel danger. And confirming the state of the hidden sage will be even more dangerous. If anything goes wrong, I'll immediately be corrupted and eroded by him. The more Katlia thought about it, the more she felt that the mission given by Mr. Fool was difficult. She had always been teetering at the periphery of the Moses ascetic order with her identity as a pirate. In fact, she had her worries about this matter. She was afraid that if she went too deep into the organization's internal affairs, it would expose the fact that she was still in contact with Queen Mystic. She was afraid that the other 10 pillars would one day suddenly point her out as a spy and eliminate her on the spot. At that moment, Katlia even wanted to abandon Mr. Fool's mission and identity as one of the 10 pillars of the Moses ascetic order. She wished to return to the dawn and return to the Queen's side. That way, she wouldn't need to worry about this matter anymore. If there were any problems, the Queen would be able to stop them. Ever since she left the dawn, she had to shoulder everything by herself. Katlia had always felt exhausted as her shoulders remained heavy. However, this thought was quickly given up by Katlia. She sighed softly. She understood that she would never be able to return to the time when she was a little girl without worries. She wasn't only responsible for her own life, but also the fate of Frank, Heath, Nina, and the other crew members. Furthermore, She had predicted the arrival of the apocalypse. She hoped that she could become the queen's most powerful helper and do something for this world. Katlia closed her eyes and muttered to herself, "Then face it." To truly integrate into the Moses ascetic order and gather the relevant information. After making this decision, Katlia no longer concealed her strength. She raised her hands and used a fairy tale magic. In the eyes of the surrounding pirate ship crew, the future and its fleet became illusory at the same time, turning into countless bubbles. The bubbles reflected a dreamy color under the light's illumination. Then they slowly melted into the sea. Just like that, the future and its fleet disappeared from everyone's eyes. Many knowledgeable pirates were first shocked and stunned. Then they had a thought. A new queen over the seas has been born. Queen of Stars. Backlund, in a particular house. Zio, who had yet to sort out her thoughts after returning to the real world, saw Furza's figure appear in front of her as she shouted, "That mission of yours is too dangerous." Zio was taken aback as she instinctively pointed out a problem. "You didn't knock." This was the worst part of living together with a demigod of the apprentice pathway. Furz first reflected on herself for a second before confidently saying, "You didn't close the door." She pointed at the ajar bedroom door. "I actually didn't close the door." "That's right. This was a last-minute gathering. I wasn't prepared for it before the matter." Zio opened her mouth, but she couldn't say a word. Both of them looked at each other speechlessly for a long time, but none of them broke the silence. Finally, Furz decided to forget the accusation and focused on the mission itself. A mission that involves Sequence 1 and a uniqueness is too dangerous. With that said, she recalled that Zio had already accepted Mr. Fool's gift. Her eyes reddened uncontrollably as she couldn't help but mumble, "Remember to get my help. At the very least, I can help you escape." To them, the things they experienced before had involved very few matters at the Sequence 1 level. Apart from Mr. Fool and the World Gehrman Sparrow, at most it was them being watched by he who must not be named. At other times, they would at most do trivial matters at the periphery of corresponding matters. They had never faced an enemy that could be addressed as him. Therefore, when she thought of how her friend's mission involved Sequence 1 beyond her characteristic, or even a uniqueness and true deity, Furz couldn't help but feel nervous and worried. Zio smiled and said, "I'm just seeking clues and investigating the truth. It's not like I need to face them directly." She paused for a second and said, "The apocalypse is approaching. We have to do something. Look, even Mr. Fool has fallen into a deep sleep. What's more, trivial figures like us. If I didn't quickly become a demigod, perhaps there's nothing I can do. Now, there's at least some hope. At the very least, I can try to awaken Mr. Fool." Furz had experienced many things and had long understood this principle. She had only been venting her emotions, but now she had calmed down. She thought for a moment and said, "What are you going to do next?" "Just relying on myself to investigate it will definitely be very difficult. I'll definitely need to use MI9's intelligence network. I plan on finding a suitable opportunity to let them know that I'm a Sequence 4 demigod. In order to not be suspected, I might need Miss Justice to give me some hints and make some arrangements," Zio answered seriously. Furz's thoughts raced. "I'll come up with a script for you. I'll act as an antagonist and simulate a lunatic who attempted to advance to Sequence 4 Imperative Mage, and then be defeated by you." As she spoke, a story took form. She immediately sat beside Zio's desk, took out a pen and paper, and started writing. "After I write up the story, I'll get Miss Justice to make some amendments and make it appear reasonable," Furz said as she wrote. As a secret sorcerer, there was no doubt that she could prevent their conversation from leaking out. Zio thought for a moment and said, "Isn't your most important task now to write the biographies and stories?" That's simple. I've already thought of plenty of scenes, and there's a lot of material on my mind." "No, nothing of that sort." After muttering a few words, Furz placed all her focus on writing a script for Zio so as to gain MI9's approval. Seeing her good friend focused on her matter, a smile gradually appeared on Zio's face. She then cast her gaze to the ajar door and heard her brother, Dio Dericha, seemingly reciting the ancient Faisak words. This was a requirement for studying law to become a lawyer. Their mother was instructing 2 servants to clean up the living room. Their voices reached Zio's ears, and her expression gradually became firm. Although she had no idea what would happen when she faced the MI9 brass, And even though she would encounter unknown dangers when completing Mr. Fool's mission, as well as the unknown future during the dawn of the apocalypse, Xiao knew that if she didn't do anything or take on certain risks and just enjoyed the pleasant times with her family just like that, she would ultimately be drowned by the floods like most people who were unprepared. And now, there was at least a path filled with brambles, one that had a glimmer of light at the end of it. It needed the realization of sacrifice, and to grasp it with courage. Chapter 1392. Yesterday, no more in a room beside the Evernight Cathedral in the southern continent, East Balam, Leonard's consciousness returned to the real world. After a few seconds of silence, he picked up the cup of coffee that had turned cold and took a sip. The bitter taste filled his mouth, gradually waking his mind up. Old man, what happened today? Finally, Leonard couldn't help but ask. After a moment of silence, Pallas Zoroast replied wistfully, "Error has perished." Error. Leonard almost didn't realize which existence Old Man was referring to. In the next second, he couldn't hide his astonishment as he nearly forgot to whisper, "Amon." This was a standard true god. Yes. Pallas Zoroast's voice sounded like he had aged considerably. To be precise, Amon's main body perished. Leonard wasn't in the mood to distinguish the subtle meaning behind Old Man's words. He asked in disbelief, "Why was there no sign of it?" He had witnessed the phenomena before and after the god of combat died. He knew that it was a change that would affect the entire world and bring about many terrifying monsters and dangerous regions. And just now, the only two abnormalities were the doors and windows suddenly closing, and him seemingly forgetting something. In reality, the latter wasn't strange at all. Most people would encounter something similar during their daily lives. Pallas Zoroast's tone sank. He should have perished in Sapphira Castle. Sapphira Castle? Leonard was shocked. The venue of the gathering he had just attended was inside Sapphira Castle. A war between gods has just erupted there? Amon actually infiltrated Sapphira Castle? Amidst Leonard's thoughts, his expression gradually turned solemn. "Old man, Mr. Fool was injured because of this and had no choice but to enter a state of slumber? Is he about to enter a state of slumber?" Pallas Zoroast asked in return. He didn't seem to be too surprised about this. Leonard tersely acknowledged. "The reason he summoned us today was because of this matter." Pallas Zoroast fell silent for a few seconds before saying, "His choice to enter a state of slumber is indeed related to the previous battle of gods and Amon's infiltration, but it's not because of injuries, but because of corruption." Corruption. Leonard blurted out in surprise. Even at Mr. Fool's level, irreversible corruption can still be encountered by him. Pallas Zoroast regained his previous poignant tone. "Everything has godhood. By relying on godhood to become a powerhouse, one can never escape the shackles of godhood. On this point, it's the same for you and me. Likewise for the fool. Perhaps he shouldn't be called the fool anymore. He is equivalent to half a Lord of the Mysteries." Lord of the Mysteries. Regarding the problem of the mental imprint in a beyond a characteristic, Leonard indeed had a deeper understanding of it than demigods at his level. However, he still had several holes in the knowledge on this matter. Even though he had heard Old Man mention the term Lord of the Mysteries, he didn't understand what it meant. However, at present, he could confirm that Mr. Fool's level had transcended Sequence 0 according to Mr. Fool's words during the gathering, and what Old Man had just said. His strength was enough to kill a true god. Leonard cleverly didn't probe further. He changed the topic in a deep voice. "Old man, why is Klein sleeping as well? Are you able to wake him up as soon as possible?" Pallas Zoroast's tone was somewhat odd. How could an old and weak angel like me know about matters at the level of gods? As for the awakening, even the fool has no better solution, much less me. Leonard remained silent for a moment. He picked up his coffee cup and took another sip. After a while he asked hesitantly, "Old man, do you have any way of stealing the artistic flair of others?" Pallas Zoroast scoffed. The definition of artistic flair is vague with no clear categorization. There's no way to steal it. However, if you change it to natural talent, there's a way. Forget it. Leonard ultimately couldn't do anything about stealing the natural talent of others to help him resolve his problem. Pallas Zoroast added with a smile, "If you can't accept this method, then you can find a natural talent that you want of someone who's very poor. Make a deal with him and give him the money he wants to exchange for the corresponding natural talent. It's a little like a deal with the devil, Leonard commented objectively. Pallas Zoros chuckled and said, there's another simple solution. That is to spend money to hire naturally talented people to help you resolve the corresponding problems. Old man, why didn't you say so earlier? Leonard instantly saw hope. Pallas Zoros scoffed. You didn't manage to think of something that simple? I thought you had eliminated this option before consulting me. Leonard ignored old man's mockery. After some serious thought, he felt that this idea was indeed feasible. However, he soon felt a little guilty and uneasy, as if he was avoiding his responsibility. Regarding this matter, I still have to do something personally. Apart from inviting someone to write songs and poems, I have to write a little. With this in mind, Leonard suddenly stood up and walked to the door. Where are you going? Pallas Zoros asked in surprise. Leonard frowned slightly as he said firmly, I'm going to the nearby bookstore to buy some poem anthologies. Ever since he advanced to Nightmare, he had given up the collection of poems he had bought in the past, making most of them nothing but decorations. When he became a spirit warlock, he began to collect poem anthologies that were suitable for some spirits to read, allowing him to chant the appropriate parts in a battle to create beyonder effects that worked in concert with him. Therefore, when he came to the southern continent, he didn't bring a single poem anthology book. He only remembered a few of those that he often used in the past. I never expected that, after becoming a high-ranking deacon, I would need to read poem anthologies again. Leonard sighed inwardly as his steps became firmer. Pallas Zoros had never imagined that Leonard's next step would be to buy poem anthologies. After a while, he probed, Is this an order from the fool? Yes, for promoting the corresponding legendary stories, Leonard answered simply as he opened the door and walked out. Pallas Zoros fell silent once again before saying, Apart from writing poems, you have to pay more attention to the besiegement of the Rose School of Thought. Leonard walked down the stairs and entered the streets. He looked at the pedestrians and nodded gently. Yes. At that moment, as he walked towards the bookstore, he felt as though he had returned to Tingen, back to the time when he was still a midnight poet. At that time, he had also walked along the bustling streets, preparing to buy a copy of Classical Poems Anthology of the Lone Kingdom and Selected Poems of Roselle. Backlund, at the Harvest Church south of the bridge. After Emlyn White regained his senses, he found himself standing in front of a window. The sun was already dim outside, and the flowers were flourishing. His feelings towards Mr. Fool's slumber were slightly different from the other Tarot Club members. Other than heaviness, poignancy, sadness, and confusion, there was also the confidence that things would end well. Internally within the Sanguine, some of the marquises and earls were rather old. Even though they lived longer than most demigods at the same level, they were still in advanced stages of their lives. At this time, they often chose to sleep and use similar methods to extend their lifespans. The effects were pretty good. Therefore, Emlyn had long been accustomed to matters regarding slumbers. He knew that it wasn't equivalent to passing away, nor was it equivalent to perishing. He believed that if the correct solution was found, Mr. Fool would have a high chance of waking up. He looked out the window and muttered to himself, Mr. Fool has entered a state of slumber, and the ancestor's revelation is often interfered with. It's obvious that she can't provide help frequently. After a brief silence, Emlyn sighed silently. Indeed. In the end, I have to face it myself and bear it. This is the destiny of the Messiah. At the mention of the word Messiah, Emlyn clearly smiled with a self-deprecating hint. He then repeated inwardly, I can only rely on myself. Just as this thought flashed through his mind, Father Yutravsky's voice sounded behind Emlyn. Time to set off. Emlyn turned his head and saw a huge sword on the back of the priest dressed in brown priest robes. The sword's length exceeded Emlyn's height, and its width was close to his waist. Together with Father Yutravsky's hill-like body, the terrifying pressure felt corporeal. As a sanguine earl, Emlyn recovered from his stifled feeling and nodded gently. Okay. Today, they would head to the southern continent to participate in the besiegement of the Rose School of Thought. Just as he replied, Emlyn suddenly recalled something and hurriedly said, Wait for half a day. He wanted to gather most of the Sanguine in Backlund to discuss the pharmaceutical company. Bishop Yutravsky didn't ask anything and nodded. Come find me when you're ready. After watching Father Yutravsky enter the depths of the cathedral, Emlyn turned his head to the Sanguine that were following him to the southern continent. Inform all the Sanguine in Backland to come over. There's something we need to discuss. Yes, Lord Earl, the Sanguine replied respectfully. After they split up, Emlyn turned his head to look at the altar and the sacred emblem of life in front of the cathedral. It was a simply drawn infant that was surrounded by symbols like wheat, flowers, spring water, and other symbols. This made Emlyn's thoughts suddenly turn adrift. He had forgotten when he started spending less time in his bedroom, spending less time with his dolls. Even his hobby of studying history became more targeted and efficient. This change didn't take form in an instant. Instead, it was slowly formed over time. It was something that made it difficult for others to notice. By the time Emlyn discovered it, he had already adapted to this new life. Emlyn retracted his gaze, raised his chin slightly, and shook his head with a smile. This is the destiny of the Messiah. Chapter 1393. Where the dream begins. After returning to the real world, Alger patiently waited for the mission Mr. Fool had mentioned. On this day, he, wearing the pontiff's clothes and the silver-black mask, was discussing the internal affairs of the Church of the Sea God with Oracle Danitz when he suddenly saw a bishop enter. Your Holiness, the Church of Storms has sent 2 gifts to congratulate you on becoming a proxy of God. The bishop held a tin box and bowed respectfully. Danitz, who had been secretly rejoicing over the malfunction of Byam's telegram, blurted out in surprise, "Where's that messenger?" "He left after leaving the present," the bishop at the door answered helplessly. Although the members of the Church of Storms often had impulsive moments, such behavior was still quite rare. Alger nodded slightly and said, "If they don't view us as enemies, sending a messenger to deliver a gift is enough." With that said, he raised his right hand and gently made the tin box in the bishop's hand fly over. After catching the small box, Alger's actions suddenly slowed down as though he found it heavy. He slowly opened the container and saw a book made of yellowish-brown goatskin. On the surface of the book, there was a line of words written in Elven. Book of Calamity. Book of Calamity. After seeing the words clearly, Alger felt a little dazed as though he was dreaming. But very quickly, he understood what the mission Mr. Fool was talking about was. Alger sighed silently and looked at the bishop at the door. "What's the second gift?" "It's a ghost ship called the Blue Avenger. It has already moored at the harbor," the bishop answered without any abnormalities. The Blue Avenger. When Danitz heard the name, he instinctively cast his gaze at the pontiff, Alger. He remembered very clearly that this was the ship Alger used back when he was a pirate. This meant that the Church of the Lord of Storms knew that the Pontiff Church of the Sea God was once their cardinal. Is this a congratulation gift, or a challenge to war? As Danitz's heart tightened, he realized that he was rather familiar with the other gift. It was the extremely sinister Book of Calamity he had seen when he followed Gehrman Sparrow. "Help me return a letter to the Church of Storms, and thank them for their gifts," Alger composed himself as he calmly instructed. After the bishop left the room, he turned to Danitz and said, "Oracle, I've received Mr. Fool's revelation. I'll have to complete a mission in the time to come. It will perhaps take me a few years before I return." "A revelation?" Danitz blurted out in surprise. At this moment, there was only one thought in his mind. "Why don't I know about this?" Alger nodded. "Mr. Fool is about to enter a deep slumber. However, this will not affect responses to your prayers." Danitz was so shocked that he couldn't speak. Alger continued, "Gehrman Sparrow has also entered a state of slumber. After I leave, the church's matters will be handed over to Elder Derek Berg of the new city of Silva. You need to cooperate with him and write into the Bible that the sea god is Mr. Fool and get all believers to accept it. Our faith is key to Mr. Fool's awakening. You are his oracle and you have to make an example in this aspect. Of course, he will give you a new revelation at any time and give you other missions." Danitz was a little dizzy and confused when he heard that, but he still understood the seriousness of the matter. He hesitated for a moment before nodding heavily. "Okay." After settling the matter, Alger stood up and returned to his room with the Book of Calamity. He looked at himself in the mirror and laughed. He slowly removed the papal tiara from his head and removed the silver-black mask on his face. A few days later, at the crowded Byam harbor, Alger raised his head and looked at Derek, who was taller than him, and said with a smile, "You've been doing very well recently. The Church of the Sea God has been running smoothly." Derek subconsciously wanted to raise his hand to scratch the back of his head, but he ultimately held back. He said with some melancholy and reluctance, "Mr. Hanged, Your Holiness Wilson, when will you return?" Alger shook his head and said, "Everything ahead is still uncertain. No one can tell." Without waiting for Derek Berg to respond, he said, "You're already mature and reliable. I don't have any advice for you." Having said that, Alger paused before saying, "If the Rorstad archipelago encounters a disaster you cannot stop, don't sacrifice yourself in order to protect it." Ah! Derek was stunned. This was the most important place of worship for Mr. Fool. It was the new home of the City of Silver, so how could he give up just like that? Alger had already expected Derek's reaction and explained with a serious expression, "To Mr. Fool, the most important thing is the believers here, not these islands. To the City of Silver, the most important thing is the people, not the city. As long as you can protect Mr. Fool's believers and protect the citizens of the City of Silver, migrating them away in time. Even if we lose Byam, the new City of Silver, and the Rorstad archipelago, we can rebuild a new city elsewhere and rebuild a new home. Remember, don't lose sight of the forest for the trees." Derek was deeply moved when he heard that. He grasped the crux of the problem. He replied sincerely, "I understand. Thank you, Mr. Hanged. Your Holiness Wilson. I will protect Mr. Fool's believers and the citizens well." Alger didn't say a word as he turned around and walked towards the Blue Avenger that was moored at the dock. The ghost ship was a three-masted sailboat that was still behind the present era, no different from before. Alger looked at it and looked at the crew members on the deck. He suddenly felt something and looked down at himself. He was wearing a linen shirt, brown jacket, and trendy pantaloons. He had a custom-made belt around his waist. Attached to it were a dagger and a scepter made of bone. The corners of Alger's lips curled up as he took a step forward and landed on the deck of the Blue Avenger. He then turned his head to look at the boundless blue sea, raised his right hand and said in a deep voice, "Set sail!" Backlund, Empress Borough. Inside the Hall family's luxurious mansion. Audrey sat on a comfortable sofa and watched her father, Earl Hall, her brothers, Hibbert and Alfred, discuss the recent developments of the kingdom. She watched as her mother Lady Caitlin constantly convened the butler and footmen to make final preparations for the ball. She didn't say a word. She wore a faint smile as she quietly observed this common scene in her daily life. After some time, Earl Hall smiled and looked over. "What is our little princess thinking about?" Audrey pursed her lips and replied with a faint smile, "Guess. I'm guessing you're thinking about which dress you'll be wearing today, and what kind of hair and makeup you'll be matching it with," Hibbert said casually on behalf of his father. Audrey smiled and said, "Correct, but there are no rewards." She slowly stood up and said to her parents and brothers, "I'm going upstairs to change into my gown." Earl Hall smiled and nodded. "There's no hurry. Everyone believes that you're worth the wait." Audrey bit her lower lip and maintained her smile as she walked towards the door. When she was about to leave the room, she paused and looked back. Her parents and her two brothers continued with their discussion or arrangements. Audrey's gaze froze as she slowly retracted her gaze. She walked out of the room and went upstairs to the bedroom. Susie was already waiting there. Audrey inhaled indiscernibly and raised her right hand. She used her index finger to draw lines of faint light. They seemed to come from the deepest part of a dreamscape. A few seconds later, the faint glow turned into a blonde, green-eyed, abnormally beautiful girl, Audrey Hall. But unlike Audrey, this girl still carried a little childishness and a slight romantic bearing. "Good evening, Miss Justice," the girl greeted her cheerfully. Audrey smiled and replied, "Good evening, Miss Audrey." After the last-minute tarot gathering, she finally made up her mind to advance to Dreamweaver and prepare to split an identity to accompany her family. She would stay away from them and not let the various dangerous matters she had attracted affect them. After staring at her for 2 seconds, she turned to look at the golden retriever beside her and said, "Susie, are you sure you want to follow me?" "Yes, we are friends forever," Susie replied seriously. Audrey didn't say another word. She split off a virtual person and entered Susie's body of heart and mind, which she opened up for Audrey. Then, she raised her hand again and outlined another Susie in midair. The moment Susie formed, she opened her mouth and let out a woof. Audrey retracted her gaze and looked at herself. After a moment of silence, although she knew that their thoughts and ideas were synced, she couldn't help but say to the blonde girl in front of her, "I'll leave it to you in the future. Remember to wheedle to father often and get him to not be so busy. He's not young anymore, so he needs to be mindful of his health. He can hand over many things to Hibbert and Alfred or the butlers. Also, slowly counsel mother and tell her that she doesn't have to pay too much attention to the opinions of others. She doesn't have to maintain a perfect image at social events. It would be very tiring. Yes, don't forget about Hibbert. Cheer him up often and don't let him be so gloomy. He shouldn't complicate matters too much from overthinking things. Alfred won't threaten his position. Alfred, he needs a good wife to stop him from taking any more risks. Oh, why are you crying? We've already grown up. We can't be little girls anymore." Audrey lowered her eyes slightly and smiled at her crying self. I know. After Audrey said that, she pursed her lips tightly and nodded heavily with a sad expression. Audrey retracted her gaze, picked up her cloak, and draped it over her. Then, she led Susie out of the bedroom and into the corridor. The hall below was lit with lights, and the guests came one after another to attend the ball. Lord Hall, Lady Caitlin, Hibbert, and Alfred were already at the door. Audrey stood behind the railing and watched silently for a while. She then lifted the ends of her skirt and slowly and solemnly bowed to her parents and brother from a distance away. After maintaining such a posture for 2 seconds, she straightened her body and raised the hood from her dark blue cloak to cover her face. To her side, behind her, there were bright lights and a bustling din. In front of her, many dark lights formed a sea of collective subconscious. "Let's go," Audrey said hoarsely to Susie. With that said, she walked into the dark illusory sea. Audrey rushed out from the bedroom and cried out with a sobbing tone, "You must come back." Audrey didn't turn back. She raised her right hand and waved it, indicating that she understood. The figure wearing a blue cloak gradually disappeared into the distance amidst the deep, silent darkness. Chapter 1394. A new journey. In a room of an abandoned castle. Sunlight shone through the gaps in the thick curtains, illuminating a pitch-black coffin. Suddenly, the lid of the coffin creaked and slowly moved to the side. With a thud, it fell to the ground. A few seconds later, Isaac Eggers sat up, looking rather lost. At that moment, he was wearing loose pajamas that had been popular in Lone years ago. He resembled a noble who had woken up in his manner. After a while, Isaac narrowed his eyes slightly. He looked around in confusion as though he didn't know who he was. He then saw the brilliant sunlight that penetrated through the cracks and saw the dust dancing in the sunlight. He saw letters scattered on the table, ground, and coffin lid around him. They were like giant snowflakes that blanketed half the area. Isaac got out of the coffin. With a puzzled expression, he bent down to pick up a letter and began reading. As he read, the confusion on his face disappeared a little, as if he had remembered many things from the past. Isaac immediately found a chair and sat down, allowing all the letters to fly in front of him to stack up like a mountain. He opened the letters one by one, reading them one after another. There would be pauses in between as he fell deep in thought, as if he was seriously recalling something. The sunlight that passed through the gap in the curtains gradually dimmed. After a long time, it shone inside again. At that moment, Isaac finally finished reading all the letters and completed the long contemplations that resembled cogitation. He looked at the letters that had been stacked on the table and slowly let out a long sigh. Following that, he took out a piece of paper, a fountain pen, and some ink that he could still use. He wrote with a warm expression, "I've already woken up and received all your letters. They made me recall who I am and who you are. I also remember many memories of the past. Your experiences, no matter how complicated and exciting, have exceeded my imagination. It also makes me understand some of the problems that previously plagued me. I can feel your joy, your exhaustion, your faith in life, and the heavy responsibility that you have borne from your letters. I can roughly guess why you ultimately made that choice. If it were me, I might not even be able to make such a decision. From the beginning, you've been a guardian. You mimicked others until you were mimicked by others. Next, I will begin a journey to pursue the past and witness the changes in this world. You seem to still be asleep, but it doesn't matter. I'll write to tell you about the interesting things that I've encountered, the interesting traditions, and interesting people. I think I should be able to send these letters to you via sacrifice." The tip of the golden pen reflected the sunlight as it rustled on the white piece of paper, continuously penning down more content. Backland, in a solarium of a terrace house. Melissa walked in with a girl who was clearly less than 10 years old. "Aunt Melissa, why here?" the little girl asked, puzzled. "All the stories I heard had mysterious rituals held in the basement." With her hair tied up, the bespectacled Melissa smiled and said, "Those are unconventional mysticism rituals." She pointed at the altar that had been set up and the unlit candles and said, "You may begin." "Really?" The little girl tilted her head to look at the bright sunshine outside the window. "Do we need to draw the curtains?" "There's no need. It's pretty good this way." After Melissa answered, she smiled at the little girl while she awkwardly mimicked her usual method of holding rituals in a clumsy and unfamiliar manner. During this process, she would instruct her from time to time and even personally help her to complete the pre-ritual preparations. "All right, repeat after me." Melissa took a deep breath as her expression gradually turned staid. "Yes, yes." The little girl tried her best to appear stern. Melissa looked at the candle flames on the altar for a few seconds before slowly reciting in ancient Hermes, "The fool that doesn't belong to this era. De pool that done belong to dis Ella." The little girl had never learned ancient Hermes before. Although she tried her best to imitate her aunt, she still didn't know what she was saying. "The mysterious ruler above the gray fog," Melissa continued reciting. "De mestawis luler above the gray pog," the little girl recited in all seriousness. "The king of yellow and black who wields good luck." After Melissa finished reciting, the candle at the end didn't wait for the little girl to imitate her. It immediately burgeoned to the size of a human head. In the large flame, a slippery tentacle with a somewhat sinister pattern extended out in an indiscernible manner. It was extremely slow. The little girl was stunned. She retreated and hid behind her aunt. Melissa pursed her lips and said with a gentle smile, "Don't be afraid, go greet him." The little girl timidly poked her head out from behind her aunt and saw the terrifying slimy tentacle gently swaying in the brilliant sunlight that shone through the windows. It seemed to be attempting to swat away the dust or was waving at her. "Go, don't be afraid," Melissa repeated. The little girl finally mustered her courage and stood in front of the altar. She recited the incantation she had just invented before revealing a sincere smile and raised her palm. The slippery tentacle whose patterns had disappeared paused for a few seconds. It seemed hesitant and somewhat out of practice. Then, it raised its head and curled up slightly, lowering itself inch by inch. Amidst the sunlight, it high-fived that tiny palm. The end. You're tuning in to the Xiaofan's Wuxia Tales YouTube channel. Don't forget to subscribe and join us on this journey to catch the most captivating stories.